The dawn mist hung heavy over Elk Valley when Eleanor Blackwood first noticed the fresh-cut fence wire. 6 horses gone without a sound, including the prize Appaloosa she'd raised from a colt. Most folks would have given those horses up for lost in the vast wilderness of the Cascade foothills. But most folks weren't trained by the legendary Nez Perce scouts who could read stories in bent grass and follow trails that didn't exist. The raiders had taken her livelihood, not knowing they'd stolen from the most formidable tracker in 3 territories. By sundown, Eleanor would begin a hunt that would become the stuff of frontier legend. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning routine at Blackwood Ranch began before first light. As predictable as the seasons, Eleanor Blackwood moved through her stables with practiced efficiency, her weathered hands checking each feeding trough and water bucket with methodical precision. At 45, the silver streaks in her dark hair caught the lantern light as she worked in the pre-dawn darkness, her movements economical and purposeful, the habits of someone who'd learned that survival required attention to detail. The modest Horse Ranch sat nestled against the western edge of Elk Valley, its 10 acres and small cabin representing 7 years of painstaking work. To the casual observer, Eleanor appeared to be nothing more than another hard-scrabble widow carving out an existence in the unforgiving territory of 1880s Washington. The locals in nearby Pinecrest knew her as the quiet woman who bred and trained some of the finest trail horses in the territory, reliable mounts that could navigate the treacherous mountain paths and endure the harsh weather of the Cascades. "Morning, boys," she murmured to the horses as she entered the main stable, her voice soft but carrying a natural authority that made even the most spirited animals settle. Except this morning, the familiar nickering that usually greeted her was absent. The unnatural silence sent a chill up her spine that had nothing to do with the autumn air. Eleanor raised her lantern higher, illuminating empty stalls where 6 horses should have been waiting. Thunder, her personal mount, a sure-footed Black Morgan, the prize Appaloosa stallion, Cloudwalker, whose bloodline she'd spent years developing, and 4 trained trail horses she'd been preparing to sell to the stage company in Tacoma. Her breath caught as she moved quickly to the back paddock, finding the fence cut with precision. A clean job that wouldn't have alerted her night dog, Old Blue, who now looked up at her apologetically from his usual sleeping spot. This wasn't an opportunistic theft. Someone had studied her routine, known exactly which horses to take, and executed the theft with military precision. Eleanor's face betrayed nothing as she surveyed the scene, but those who knew her well might have noticed the slight narrowing of her eyes. Slate grey and sharp as a winter storm, she knelt by the cut fence wire, fingers hovering just above the dew-dampened ground, reading the soil like others might read a book. Marshall Thompson needs to see this, she said to herself, though she held little hope that Pinecrest's aging lawman could do much. Horse thieves in this territory typically vanished into the wilderness, crossing into Idaho or Oregon before a posse could even form. Eleanor returned to her cabin, a simple one-room structure with a stone fireplace and walls decorated with practical items, herbs hanging to dry, a collection of handcrafted knives, and maps of the surrounding mountains marked with notations only she could decipher. She changed into her work clothes, sturdy canvas pants that had scandalized Pinecrest when she'd first arrived, a flannel shirt, and a leather vest with multiple pockets containing tools of her own design. As she dressed, her hand brushed against the small wooden box on her bedside table, the only personal item displayed in the otherwise utilitarian cabin. Inside lay a silver medallion engraved with the symbol of the U.S. Army Scout Service, and a faded photograph of Eleanor standing beside an elderly Nez Perce man, both dressed in tracking gear, mountains rising in the background. 7 years ago, She'd packed away that life, buried it beneath the identity of widow Blackwood horse breeder. The people of Pinecrest knew nothing of Eleanor Reynolds, the woman who had spent 15 years as one of the most accomplished civilian trackers in the Army's employ, trained from childhood by Grey Wolf, a Nez Perce scout who had adopted her. After her missionary parents died in an outbreak, they didn't know about her uncanny ability to follow trails days old through blizzards and flash floods, or how she could track a man across bare rock, leaving no more sign than a shadow. The skills that had once made her the Army's secret weapon in locating renegade bands and lost patrols had been relegated to finding strayed cattle for neighboring ranches and occasionally helping locate lost children in the woods. She had chosen anonymity after the Black Rock Pass incident, the failed pursuit that had cost her husband David his life and left her with a bullet scar across her left shoulder. Eleanor poured herself a cup of strong coffee, her mind calculating, assessing. The horse thieves had left during the night with at least a 6-hour head start. They'd been smart enough to choose a night after a light rain, hoping the dampened ground would obscure their trail. Amateurs might be discouraged, but Eleanor had tracked men through worse. "Mrs. Blackwood?" a voice called from outside, accompanied by a polite knock. "Mrs. Blackwood, it's Deputy Reed." She opened the door to find Pinecrest's young deputy shifting awkwardly on her porch, hat in hand. At 25, Sam Reed was earnest and hard-working if inexperienced, a stark contrast to the often inebriated Marshal Thompson. "Morning, Deputy," Eleanor acknowledged, gesturing for him to enter. "I was about to ride into town. Someone took 6 of my horses during the night." Reed's eyes widened. "That's what brings me out here, ma'am. Jennings' place was hit too. 4 of his best draft horses, and the Miller brothers lost 3. Seems we've got organized thieves working the valley." Eleanor's expression didn't change, but her mind was already connecting the pieces. "They're gathering stock for a large sale then, probably heading for the territories where questions aren't asked." "Marshall's organizing a posse," Reed said, though his tone suggested little faith in the effort. "But with the rain last night, and the rocky ground up towards Serpent Pass," he trailed off, the impossible nature of the tracking job hanging unspoken between them. Eleanor nodded slowly, returning to the stove to pour a second cup of coffee for the deputy. "I'll ride in with you, take a look at the other sites. Perhaps there's something to be learned." What she didn't say was that she'd already noted the distinctive pattern in the fence cutting, a technique favored by Army deserters turned rustlers. She'd recognized the hoofprints of a horse with an unusual shoe modification that she'd seen only once before, during a pursuit in Montana Territory 3 years ago. Most telling was the deliberate attempt to brush away tracks leading north while leaving subtle signs pointing east, a misdirection tactic she herself had taught to Army scouts. These weren't ordinary horse thieves. They were organized, experienced, and dangerous, and they had just stolen from the one person in the territory who could follow them through hell itself if necessary. As Deputy Reed sipped his coffee, oblivious to the calculations happening behind Eleanor's composed expression, she made her decision. She would give the appearance of cooperating with Marshal Thompson's doomed posse attempt, but by nightfall she would be on the trail alone, equipped with tracking skills the thieves couldn't possibly anticipate. "I'll need to secure my remaining stock first," she told Reed, her mind already inventorying the supplies she would need for the journey. "Tell the Marshal I'll be along directly." When the deputy departed, Eleanor moved to the loose floorboard beneath her bed, pulling up the hidden compartment to reveal the tools of her former trade. A specialized compass, customized tracking glasses, designed to reveal impressions in different lights, and a leather-bound journal filled with notes on tracking techniques developed over decades. Beneath these lay a Winchester rifle, modified for accuracy and wrapped in waxed cloth, and a Colt revolver that had been her constant companion during 15 years of frontier tracking. Eleanor Blackwood had spent 7 years hiding her abilities, blending into the background of Elk Valley. Now, someone had forced her hand, not realizing they had just awakened one of the most relentless trackers the frontier had ever known. The Pinecrest Town Hall buzzed with angry voices as Eleanor slipped quietly through the door. Nearly every rancher and farmer in the valley had gathered, their faces tight with worry and outrage. 13 prized horses stolen in a single night represented not just a financial blow, but a threat to their very survival in the harsh Washington territory. Marshal Thompson stood at the front of the room, his once imposing frame now bent with age and whiskey. Beside him, Deputy Reed catalogued the stolen horses' descriptions in a ledger, looking overwhelmed by the task before him. Folks, settle down," Thompson called, raising weathered hands. "We've got a situation, but panic won't bring those horses back. I'm organizing a posse to ride out this afternoon." Eleanor found a spot against the back wall, observing. Her arrival drew a few curious glances, a woman at a meeting typically reserved for the valley's men, but most were too preoccupied to pay her much attention. "With all due respect, Marshal," Franklin Jennings spoke up, his voice carrying the weight of the valley's largest ranch. "Those thieves have at least a 12-hour head start, and the rain last night would have washed away any tracks. We'd be chasing ghosts." Thompson's face reddened. "You got a better suggestion, Jennings?" "Telegraph the territorial marshal in Olympia," someone called. "Get experienced trackers in here." "Take 2 days minimum," Thompson countered. "By then those horses will be across state lines or up in the mountain passes." Eleanor remained silent, watching the pointless debate unfold. Her eyes drifted to the large territory map hanging on the wall, already calculating routes, natural choke points, and water sources the thieves would need to use if moving a large string of horses. "Mrs. Blackwood," Deputy Reed suddenly called, turning all eyes toward her. "You're the one who noticed the theft first. Anything unusual you might have seen, anything that might help?" The room fell silent as the men turned to stare at the widow, many clearly doubting a woman alone would have noticed anything of value. Eleanor straightened slightly, weighing how much to reveal. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The fence was cut with a cavalry wire cutter," she said quietly, her voice nonetheless carrying through the room. "Not common tools for ordinary thieves." Marshal Thompson frowned. "And how would you recognize such a thing, Mrs. Blackwood?" Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "My late husband was in the cavalry, Marshal. I recognize the pattern. It wasn't a lie, merely an omission. David had indeed served briefly, though Eleanor had spent far more time working alongside military units than he ever had. The thieves also left false trails," she continued, pulling a small notebook from her vest pocket. "Signs pointing east toward Serpent Pass, but the horses were actually taken north toward Blackwater Ridge." The room erupted in surprised murmurs. "How can you be so sure?" Jennings demanded, skepticism heavy in his voice. Eleanor opened her notebook, revealing a detailed sketch of horseshoe prints. "Because one of the horses they're riding has a distinctive shoe. Custom work with an unusual wear pattern on the left front hoof. The impression is deeper on the north trail, hidden beneath brush. They disturbed when passing." The men exchanged glances, clearly questioning how a widow who bred horses could make such precise observations. Dr. Rebecca Wilson, the town's physician and one of the few who'd made an effort to befriend Eleanor, stepped forward with a knowing smile. "Perhaps you gentlemen aren't aware that Mrs. Blackwood routinely tracks down strayed livestock for half the valley. Just last month she found the Peterson boy when he wandered off into the hills, in the middle of that heavy fog, no less." Eleanor shot Rebecca a grateful look. The doctor knew more than most about Eleanor's past, having treated her shoulder. wound during a particularly painful flare-up 2 winters ago, but she'd kept Eleanor's confidence. With all due respect, Jennings persisted, finding a stray cow is a far cry from tracking organized horse thieves. Eleanor closed her notebook. My observations are yours to use or ignore, Mr. Jennings. I merely thought they might help. Marshal Thompson studied her with narrowed eyes, something like recognition flickering across his face. You know, you remind me of someone I met years back. The army had this civilian tracker, woman who could follow a trail that wasn't even there. Story was she could track a fish through water if she had to. Eleanor kept her expression neutral, though her pulse quickened. Thompson had been stationed at Fort Walla Walla during her time working with the army. Sounds like tall tales soldiers tell around campfires, Marshal. Maybe so, Thompson conceded, but his gaze remained thoughtful. But I'd be a fool to ignore good information, regardless of the source. Mrs. Blackwood, would you be willing to show us exactly where you think they headed? Eleanor nodded once, relieved the conversation was moving away from her past. I can mark it on your map. As she moved to the front of the room, conversation resumed around her. She took the pencil Deputy Reed offered, making quick, precise markings. On the territory map that showed not just the direction she believed the thieves had taken, but the likely route they would follow based on terrain, water access, and the limitation of moving multiple horses. What she didn't explain was how she knew these details, how years of tracking had taught her to think like her quarry, to anticipate their needs and limitations. She didn't mention that her old trail partner, Grey Wolf, had taught her to see the landscape as a living entity that kept records of every creature's passing, if one knew how to read the signs. They'll avoid the main trails, she explained, her finger tracing a faint line on the map. But they can't take 13 horses through the dense forest either. They'll follow game trails here, here, and here. She marked 3 spots. They'll need water by midday, which means Coldwater Creek is their likely first stop. The men crowded. Closer, their initial skepticism giving way to grudging interest. That's good tracking, Mrs. Blackwood, Deputy Reed said with genuine admiration. It's just observation, Eleanor replied softly, through her eyes revealing a depth of knowledge that went far beyond casual observation. As the meeting concluded and the posse preparations began, Rebecca pulled Eleanor aside into the relative privacy of the town hall's small kitchen. You're going after them yourself, aren't you? The doctor asked bluntly. Eleanor's slight smile was answer enough. Eleanor, these aren't just opportunistic thieves. Organized horse rustling is dangerous. Business, these men won't hesitate to kill anyone who follows them. I'm well aware of the risks, Eleanor replied, checking that no one could overhear them. But those horses represent my livelihood. Without them, especially Cloudwalker, I lose everything I've built. Rebecca studied her friend's face. This isn't just about the horses, though, is it? I've seen that look before, when you found the Peterson boy. When you're on a trail, you become different, like you're finally allowing yourself to be who you really are. Eleanor was silent for a long moment. 7 years is a long time to keep part of yourself buried, she finally admitted. But I had my reasons. Blackrock Pass, Rebecca said quietly. Eleanor's eyes flashed with surprise. Army doctors talk to each other, Rebecca explained. I had a colleague at Fort Walla Walla who mentioned an incident, a tracking mission that went wrong. He treated a female tracker with a shoulder wound who vanished from the fort afterward. She touched Eleanor's arm gently. He didn't give me a name, but I've treated that scar, Eleanor. I know what a bullet wound looks like. Eleanor's posture tensed, then gradually relaxed. After years of guarding her secrets, there was something almost liberating about being truly seen. David died because of my overconfidence, she said softly. I was so certain of my abilities, so sure I could out-track anyone, that I led us straight into an ambush. I swore I'd never put anyone else at risk again. She glanced toward the main room where the posse was gathering. "That's why I need to do this alone." Rebecca gripped her arm firmly. "At least let me help you prepare. I know you've been having trouble with that shoulder in cold weather, and there's a storm moving in from the north." Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. "I'll stop by your office before I leave. But Rebecca, not a word to anyone," the doctor promised. "Though I suspect Marshal Thompson is starting to piece things together on his own. He may be fond of whiskey these days, but he wasn't always the man you see now." As they rejoined the main group, Eleanor watched the men preparing for their futile posse ride, checking guns, gathering supplies, arguing over routes. They would follow the obvious trails, make plenty of noise, and return empty-handed in a day or two. Meanwhile, she would be following signs invisible to most: broken spiderwebs indicating recent passage, the subtle compression of dew on moss, the slight discoloration of crushed lichen on rocks, all the minute details that would lead her straight to the thieves who had no idea they were about to be hunted by someone who could read the very language of the wilderness itself. 20 miles north of Elk Valley, in a secluded box canyon hidden from casual travelers, Victor Holloway surveyed his growing collection of stolen horses with the calculating eye of a businessman assessing inventory. At 38, the former cavalry captain's weathered face bore the scars of battles both military and personal, the most prominent stretching from his right temple down to his jaw, a permanent reminder of his dishonorable discharge 6 years earlier. 13 fine specimens, he announced to the 5 men gathered around the morning fire. "Price we'll get in Montana territory. We're looking at nearly $2,000 for this haul alone." His second-in-command, Curtis Walsh, a lanky former sergeant with cold eyes, tossed another log on the fire. "That Appaloosa stallion alone will fetch 300. Never seen bloodlines like that outside Army stock." "Because it is Army stock, modified," Holloway replied, unable to hide his admiration as he walked to where the magnificent stallion was picketed. "That pattern comes from the Nez Perce breeding program. Someone put considerable work into developing this horse." He ran experienced hands along the animal's powerful legs. "Perfect conformation, excellent bone structure. This is a stud that could find a whole operation." Walsh frowned, watching their boss's growing attachment. "Though the plan was to sell them all at the Montana rendezvous. Can't afford to get sentimental over merchandise, Captain." Holloway's eyes hardened at the challenge, his hand instinctively drifting to the Remington revolver on his hip. The men around the fire grew silent, recognizing the dangerous shift in mood. "Plans can change, Curtis, especially when opportunity presents itself." Holloway turned to a younger man tending the horses. "Mason, what'd you learn about the Appaloosa's owner when you were scouting Pinecrest?" Mason Parker, barely 25, but already sporting a gunslinger's calm, looked up from his work. "Widow woman named Blackwood. Runs the place alone. Breeds and trains trail horses mainly. Been there about 7 years from what the saloon talk said. A widow handling stock of this quality on her own?" Holloway's interest was clearly piqued. "That's unusual." "Town seems to think highly of her," Mason continued, adjusting the picket line. "Overheard she's got some knack with animals, trains them better than most men could." Walsh spat into the fire. "It doesn't make any difference who owns them. By the time any posse forms in Pinecrest, we'll be halfway to the Montana border." The 5th man, a stocky Mexican-American named Gabriel Reyes, who served as their scout, approached from his lookout position. Unlike the others, Reyes moved with a natural stealth that spoke of indigenous heritage, his eyes constantly scanning. "Their surroundings, Captain," he said quietly, his accent subtle but present. "I've been studying our back trail. Something ain't right." Holloway's attention shifted immediately. In their 3 years of operations across Washington, Oregon, and Idaho territories, Reyes's instincts had saved them more than once. "Explain." It wasn't a request, but a command. the reflexive tone of an officer expecting immediate intelligence. "No. Pursuit follows us. I would have spotted a posse. But when I checked our crossing at Coldwater Creek, I found disturbed stones that we didn't move." Reyes held out his hand, displaying a small piece of thread caught on a thorn. "This wasn't there when we passed. Someone's following, but they're being very careful not to be seen." Walsh's hand moved to his rifle. "Territorial marshals?" "No." Reyes shook his head, certainty in his voice. "Marshal would have a posse. This is one person, maybe two, moving light and fast, and they know what they're doing." Holloway's expression darkened. During his military years, he'd commanded scout units and knew the rare skill set required to track without being detected. "How far back?" "Hard to say," Reyes admitted. "Whoever it is knows how to mask their presence. I only found signs because I was specifically looking. They're good, very good." "Better than you?" Walsh challenged. Reyes met his gaze evenly. "Possibly." The admission hung heavy over the camp. Reyes had been trained by Apache scouts in Arizona Territory and had rarely encountered anyone who could match his tracking skills. Holloway processed this information, military training automatically assessing threat levels and response options. "One tracker, however skilled, isn't an immediate danger, but I don't like the unknown." He turned to the remaining two men, brothers named Harlan and Jeffrey Briggs, who specialized in covering their trail. "You two, take the ridge trail back, about 5 miles. Set up an ambush point where the path narrows by split rock. If someone's following us, they'll have to pass through there." The brothers nodded, gathering their rifles and ammunition with the efficiency of longtime outlaws. "Kill shot only," Holloway instructed. "We can't afford to leave anyone alive who can identify us." As the Briggs brothers departed, Holloway returned to the Appaloosa stallion, his mind still calculating the unexpected profit this animal represented. Beyond its immediate cash value, a horse of this quality could form the cornerstone of a legitimate operation, perhaps the kind of second chance he'd been seeking since his military career had imploded. "We're moving out in an hour," he announced to the remaining men. "Change of plans. Instead of heading straight for Montana, we'll cut through Devil's Gulch and lay low at the old mining camp for a day or two. Let's see if our shadow follows us into that death trap." Walsh nodded grudgingly, recognizing the tactical wisdom. Devil's Gulch was a narrow canyon with sheer walls and only one entrance. Anyone following them would be exposed and vulnerable. "What about the horses?" Mason asked. "That's rough country for this many animals." "They'll manage," Holloway replied, dismissively. "We'll lose the weakest ones if necessary. The prime stock is what matters." As they prepared to move out, Holloway found himself returning repeatedly to the puzzle of the Appaloosa's owner. Something about the situation nagged at him. A widow breeding military-quality horses, living alone in frontier territory, managing stock that would challenge even experienced horsemen. "Mason," he called as they began breaking camp. "This widow. Blackwood, did anyone mention where she came from? Her background?" The young outlaw considered the question while packing his saddlebags. "Nothing specific. Pretty private from what I gathered. Keeps to herself mostly." He paused, remembering something. "Though the barman did mention she sometimes helps find lost livestock. Said she's got an eye for tracking strays." Something cold settled in Holloway's gut, the instinctive wariness of a predator recognizing potential danger. During his military years, he worked with trackers of various skills, including several women trained by native tribes. One, in particular, came to mind, a civilian scout who had earned a fearsome reputation among both the army and hostile tribes for her uncanny ability to follow trails that others couldn't even see. "What's her first name?" he asked, his voice deceptively casual. "Eleanor, I think." Holloway stilled, memories surfacing of a tracking operation years ago, an army scout named Eleanor with preternatural abilities who had nearly caught him during his first horse theft. the crime that had led to his dishonorable discharge. He'd never seen her face, but her reputation had been legendary among cavalry officers. "Captain?" Walsh prompted, noting his sudden change in demeanor. Holloway quickly masked his concern. "Just curious. Let's move out." As they mounted up and prepared to leave, Holloway cast one final glance back down their trail. If his suspicion was correct, if the widow following them was who he feared, then the Briggs brothers might be riding into far more danger than they realized. Miles back, Eleanor Blackwood crouched beside Coldwater Creek, her experienced fingers lightly touching disturbed moss on a riverside boulder. Her borrowed mount, a sturdy paint gelding from Rebecca's stable, grazed quietly nearby while she assessed the thieves' crossing point. 5 horses had crossed here, she noted, 4 carrying riders, 1 serving as a pack horse. The stolen animals had been herded together, their tracks overlapping in a way that made counting difficult for ordinary trackers. But Eleanor wasn't ordinary. The slight differences in hoof size, depth of impression, and stride length told her exactly how many animals had passed, and approximately when. 13 stolen horses, she murmured to herself. 5 horses ridden by the thieves. Well-organized operation. She pulled out her small leather notebook, making quick sketches of distinctive hoof patterns. One set of tracks in particular caught her attention. A horse with an unusual gait, slightly favoring its right front leg. The rider of this horse had dismounted by the creek, his boot print showing a distinctive wear pattern on the left heel. Military boots, custom modified. Eleanor's pulse quickened as she studied the print more carefully. There was something familiar about that boot pattern, something that tugged at memories from years past. She pulled out her tracking glasses, specially modified spectacles with magnifying lenses that could be swung into place for detailed examination, and studied the impression more closely. A chill ran through her that had nothing to do with the autumn air. She recognized that boot print. 7 years ago at Black Rock Pass, she and David had been tracking a band of horse thieves led by a dishonorably discharged cavalry officer. The pursuit had ended in disaster when they'd ridden into an ambush. David had died instantly. Eleanor had taken a bullet in the shoulder before escaping, the failure haunting her into self-imposed exile. The leader of those thieves had worn custom-modified cavalry boots with a distinctive repair to the left heel. "Holloway," she whispered, the name bitter on her tongue. Eleanor stood slowly, surveying the landscape with new wariness. If Victor Holloway was leading these raiders, the situation was far more dangerous than she'd initially assessed. Holloway wasn't just any horse thief. He was a former cavalry captain with tactical training and a reputation for ruthless efficiency. His knowledge of military tracking countermeasures would make him a formidable opponent, even for someone with her skills. More concerning was the possibility that he might recognize her name. If Mason Parker had been gathering intelligence in Pinecrest for days before the theft, as she suspected, Holloway might already know exactly whose horses he had stolen. Eleanor carefully remounted, her mind recalculating her approach. Direct. Pursuit was now too risky. Holloway would be expecting it and likely setting traps. She needed to anticipate his movements, predict his destination, rather than follow his trail. Studying the terrain from her elevated position, Eleanor considered the options available to someone moving 13 valuable horses through hostile territory. They would need water, relatively easy passage, and security from casual observation. He's heading for Devil's Gulch, she realized suddenly, the pattern becoming clear. The narrow canyon offered the perfect defensive position, a natural funnel that would force any pursuer into a vulnerable approach. With fluid grace that belied her years, Eleanor swung her mount away from the creek and toward a game trail visible only to experienced eyes. If Holloway expected her to follow his trail directly, she would disappoint him. Instead, she would circle wide, using terrain and weather reading skills that even military scouts rarely mastered. As she rode, dark clouds gathered on the northern horizon, promising the season's first serious storm. Most trackers would consider this development a disaster, washing away all signs of passage. Eleanor allowed herself a grim smile. What Holloway didn't know, what few people outside her Nez Perce mentors understood, was that rain created new kinds of tracks for those who knew how to read them. Water flow patterns, the way droplets collected on disturbed vegetation, the subtle differences in mud consistency, all became a new language for someone trained to read them. The storm that Holloway likely thought would cover his escape would instead become Eleanor's ally, revealing secrets that dry ground could never tell. The narrow game trail wound through stands of ancient pines as Eleanor guided her mount with subtle pressure from her knees, leaving her hands free to scan the surrounding forest. The afternoon sun filtered through the canopy, creating a dappled pattern of light and shadow that most would find disorienting. For Eleanor, these shifting patterns were merely another layer of information, revealing wind direction, animal movements, and potential blind spots where an ambush might lurk. She'd abandoned Holloway's direct trail 2 hours earlier, opting instead for a parallel route that would intersect with the most logical path toward Devil's Gulch. The decision wasn't just tactical, it was born of hard-earned wisdom. Following directly behind Holloway would play into his military training, making her vulnerable to the ambush she was certain he'd set. The wind shifted slightly, carrying the distinct scent of tobacco. Eleanor immediately reined her horse to a stop, her body tensing. No traveler with legitimate business would be waiting motionless in these woods, and locals knew better than to smoke while hunting. With practiced silence, she dismounted and secured her horse to a nearby sapling, then removed her tracking glasses and tucked them safely into an inner pocket. Drawing her Winchester from its scabbard, she moved forward on foot, each step placed with deliberate care to avoid creating noise. 20 years of tracking had taught her to move like a ghost through even the densest underbrush. 50 yards ahead, the game trail narrowed as it passed between two massive boulder formations, a perfect location for an ambush. Through a gap in the trees, Eleanor caught a brief glimpse of sunlight reflecting off metal. Someone was waiting at Split Rock, just as she'd anticipated. Holloway was too experienced to leave his back trail unguarded. Circling wide to approach from the south, Eleanor used the terrain to mask her movements. She'd studied these mountains for 7 years, learning every game trail and seasonal creek. Now she moved through them with the confidence of a predator in familiar territory, her knowledge transforming the forest from potential threat to valuable ally. 20 minutes of careful maneuvering brought her to an elevated position above and behind the ambush point. From her vantage, she could see 2 men positioned on either side of the trail, the distinctive red-checked shirt of one marking him as one of the figures she'd glimpsed at Jennings's ranch during her earlier investigation. The Briggs brothers, she assessed, recalling the descriptions from wanted posters she'd studied in her previous life. Harlan and Jeffrey, known for their skill at setting ambushes. They'd positioned themselves well, with clear fields of fire covering the trail approach. Anyone following Holloway's main trail would ride directly into their trap. Eleanor studied their setup with professional detachment. They'd chosen their positions based on the assumption that a pursuer would follow the obvious trail and approach from the east. Their attention was focused entirely in that direction, leaving their western flank, where Eleanor now positioned herself, relatively unguarded. A novice might have taken the shot immediately, but Eleanor had learned the value of patience. For nearly an hour, she observed the brothers, noting their habits, the frequency with which they checked their surroundings, and the pattern of their movements. Jeffrey, the younger brother, was fidgety and checked his pocket watch repeatedly. Harlan maintained better discipline, but favored his right side, possibly nursing an old injury. As the afternoon wore on, their vigilance began to fade. The monotony of waiting dulled their attention, and their conversation, snippets of which carried to Eleanor's position, revealed growing impatience. "Should have been here by now," Geoffrey muttered, checking his watch yet again. "Captain said they'd be following close." "Shut up and keep watching," Harlan replied, though his own attention had clearly waned. "Reyes was certain someone was trailing us." Eleanor smiled grimly. Gabriel Reyes, that explained the quality of the counter-tracking measures she'd observed. She'd encountered the scout during her army days and respected his abilities. If Holloway had Reyes in his outfit, he'd assembled a formidable team indeed. The brothers' conversation confirmed her suspicions. Holloway was aware of pursuit, but hadn't yet identified his pursuer. More importantly, he expected her to be following his direct trail, which meant the main group was continuing toward Devil's Gulch, believing this ambush would eliminate any threat. Eleanor weighed her options carefully. She could bypass this, trap entirely, continuing her parallel approach to intercept Holloway's group, but leaving armed men at her back violated a cardinal rule of tracking. Alternatively, she could eliminate the threat now, but gunfire would alert Holloway that his ambush had failed. A third option presented itself as clouds darkened the western sky. The approaching storm front would provide cover, both visual and auditory. Decision made, Eleanor retreated silently from her observation point and returned to her horse. From her saddlebag, she removed a small pouch containing various tools of her trade. Among them was a slender wooden tube with distinctive markings, a gift from Grey Wolf during her training. The Nez Perce scout had taught her to use this call to mimic a wounded elk, a sound that would carry through the forest and draw predators or curious hunters. Moving to a position several hundred yards northeast of the ambush, the opposite direction. From Holloway's trail, Eleanor waited for the first distant rumble of thunder before raising the call to her lips. The mournful sound of a wounded elk penetrated the forest, rising and falling with perfect mimicry. She waited 5 minutes, then repeated the call, slightly more urgent this time. Through her field glasses, she observed the expected reaction. The Briggs brothers stirred, exchanging words she couldn't hear. The possibility of adding fresh meat to their provisions proved too tempting to resist. After a brief discussion, Geoffrey shouldered his rifle and moved toward the sound, while Harlan maintained his position at the ambush point. Eleanor had anticipated this. Splitting up was the logical approach for men expecting potential pursuit. She circled through the underbrush, positioning herself to intercept Geoffrey's path. The young outlaw moved with reasonable woodcraft, but lacked the practiced silence of a true hunter. Each snapping twig and crushed leaf might as well have been a shout announcing his position. When he passed within 10 feet of her position, Eleanor stepped out behind him, her Winchester leveled at the center of his back. "Don't move," she said, quietly. "And don't call out unless you want this to end badly." Geoffrey froze, his body tensing as he processed the situation. Eleanor could almost see the calculations running through his mind, whether he could turn and fire before she pulled the trigger. "That would be unwise," she cautioned, reading his intent in the subtle shift of his weight. "Your rifle's at the wrong angle, and I won't miss." "Who are you?" he asked, voice tight with controlled fear. "The owner of the Appaloosa your boss stole." Eleanor replied evenly. "Now, very carefully lower your rifle to the ground." Geoffrey complied slowly, then began to turn. "Eyes forward," Eleanor commanded. "I have questions, and you're going to provide answers." "Lady, you have no idea who you're dealing with," Geoffrey said, attempting bravado despite his compromised position. "Victor Holloway, former captain, dishonorable discharge. Curtis Walsh, his second. Gabriel Reyes, scout. You and your brother, Harlan, and the kid, Mason Parker." Eleanor's tone remained conversational, but the detailed knowledge clearly unsettled her captive. Did I miss anyone? Geoffrey's shoulders slumped slightly. Where are they taking the horses? Silence stretched between them, broken only by another distant rumble of thunder. Your brother can't help you, Eleanor continued calmly, and Holloway's not coming back for you. You're on your own. They'll kill me if I talk, Geoffrey finally responded, genuine fear edging his voice. You should be more concerned about your immediate situation, Eleanor countered. But I'm not interested in killing. Cooperate, and you'll be delivered to Marshal Thompson alive. The young outlaw seemed to weigh his options, the reality of his position settling in. Devil's Gulch, he finally offered. Old mining camp at the north end, but it won't matter. You'll never get past the captain. He's expecting a pursuit. And after Devil's Gulch, Geoffrey hesitated again before answering. Montana Territory. Horse trader named Sullivan, operates out of Fort Benton, pays cash, no questions. Eleanor processed this information against her mental map of the territory. The route made strategic sense. Remote trails leading to a territorial border crossing where jurisdiction became murky and pursuit often ended. How many horses have you stolen before this? This is the 8th operation, he admitted reluctantly. Never hit the same territory twice. Captain plans everything, knows all the escape routes from his army days. Eleanor's suspicions about Holloway's operation were confirmed. This was a sophisticated enterprise, not opportunistic theft. The gang's methods matched what she'd observed at Black Rock Pass 7 years earlier. One last question, she said, her voice taking on a harder edge. Your boss, did he ever mention an incident at Black Rock Pass? A tracker he ambushed? Geoffrey tensed again. Lady, I don't know what you're talking about. The response seemed genuine, which meant the younger members of Holloway's gang might not know the full history of their leader's operations. Before she could decide how to secure her prisoner, a distant signal whistle cut through the forest, Harlan checking on his brother's extended absence. Eleanor made a split-second decision. We're going to meet your brother now. You'll walk ahead. Of me, hands where I can see them, any attempt to warn him, and this ends differently than I'd prefer. You can't take both of us, Geoffrey challenged, though uncertainty wavered in his voice. I tracked 5 experienced men through terrain they thought would hide their trail, Eleanor replied with quiet confidence. Taking 2 Briggs brothers isn't beyond my capabilities. She secured Geoffrey's wrists with a leather thong, collected his rifle, and marched him forward. The approaching storm had darkened the forest further, creating shadows that would mask their approach. As they neared the ambush point, Eleanor positioned Geoffrey carefully, then used the elk call once more, this time from close range. The distress call, coming from the direction his brother had gone, brought Harlan instantly to his feet. Jeff, he called, concerned overriding caution. Eleanor urged Geoffrey forward with gentle pressure from her rifle barrel. Tell him you're coming in, and everything's fine. It's me, Harlan, Geoffrey called, strain evident in his voice despite his attempt at normalcy. Found nothing out there. As they emerged into the small clearing by Split Rock, Harlan's expression shifted from relief to alarm as he registered his brother's bound wrists and the figure moving behind him. His rifle came up instinctively. I wouldn't, Eleanor advised, her Winchester steady. Your brother's standing directly in your line of fire, and I have no such impediment. Harlan's eyes narrowed as he assessed the grey-haired woman holding his brother hostage. Confusion flickered across his features. Clearly, she was not what he had expected. Lady, you're making a mistake, he said, rifle still raised. Do you have any idea who you're interfering with? I know exactly who I'm dealing with, Eleanor replied calmly. The question is whether you're willing to risk your brother's life to protect stolen horses. The first heavy drops of rain began to fall, punctuating the tense standoff. The Pinecrest jail had not housed 2 prisoners simultaneously in recent memory. Its single cell, with iron bars that had begun to rust at their moorings, now contained the Briggs brothers, both sporting minor injuries from their encounter with a woman they'd severely underestimated. Marshal Thompson stood in the doorway of his office, watching Deputy Reed secure the cell door with a heavy padlock. The aging lawman's expression wavered between disbelief and grudging admiration as he turned to Eleanor, who sat calmly at his desk, penning her statement. "You mean to tell me," Thompson said, not for the first time, "that you tracked these men through 20 miles of wilderness in the dark during a rainstorm, then took them both prisoner without firing a shot?" Eleanor's pen didn't pause as she continued writing. "I fired one shot, Marshal, to convince Harlan that his brother's safety was worth more than his pride." She glanced up briefly. The bullet passed through his hat, not his head. A distinction he eventually appreciated. Deputy Reed couldn't contain his excitement as he rejoined them. "Mrs. Blackwood, that's the most incredible thing I've ever heard. How did you even find them? The posse lost the trail completely when that storm hit." Eleanor completed her statement and signed it with a practiced hand. "Tracking isn't about following footprints, Deputy. It's about understanding your quarry, predicting their needs, limitations, and decisions." She handed the document to Thompson. "Holloway's men needed a defensible position for their ambush. Split Rock was the logical choice." Thompson studied the statement, then placed it carefully on his desk. His bloodshot eyes, remnants of years of hard drinking, now held a clarity that suggested her story had cut through more than just his professional skepticism. "Reynolds," he said quietly, the name hanging in the air between them. Eleanor's expression remained carefully neutral, though her fingers tensed slightly on the edge of the desk. "That's who you are, isn't it?" Thompson continued. "Eleanor Reynolds, Army Scout. They called you the Shadow Walker." The small office fell silent. Deputy Reed looked between them in confusion, while from the cell the Briggs brothers suddenly paid closer attention. "My name is Eleanor Blackwood," she replied evenly. "Has been 7 years." Thompson nodded slowly, a gesture that acknowledged both her words and their deliberate omission. "Served with Major Reynolds myself, briefly. Fort Walla Walla, 76, good. Man, died in some incident I never got the full story on." "Black Rock Pass," Eleanor supplied, her voice so soft it was barely audible. The name clearly cost her something to speak aloud. "He was a good man. The best." Understanding dawned in Thompson's eyes, followed by genuine respect. "Well, Mrs. Blackwood, your statement's in order. Those horses you recovered from the Briggs brothers will need to be returned to their owners, but we'll need you to identify which ones came from your property." "Of course," Eleanor agreed, rising from the chair. The exchange felt like a pact. Thompson would respect her chosen identity, at least officially. The door to the marshal's office burst open, admitting a gust of rain-laden wind and 5 men led by Franklin Jennings. The wealthy rancher's face was flushed with a mixture of exertion and outrage, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled from riding in the storm. "Thompson," he bellowed, water dripping from his expensive coat, "your posse's a complete failure. 6 hours of riding in circles and not a single—" He broke off as he registered Eleanor's presence. Then the prisoners were visible through the inner doorway. His expression cycled from confusion to disbelief. "What's happening here?" Marshal Thompson straightened to his full height, some of his former authority returning to his bearing. "Mrs. Blackwood has apprehended 2 of the horse thieves and recovered 7 of the stolen animals. They're currently in the livery stable awaiting identification by their owners." "Mrs. Blackwood?" Jennings echoed incredulously, turning to stare at Eleanor as though seeing her for the first time. "The widow?" "The very same," Thompson confirmed, a hint of satisfaction in his tone. "Tracked them through the storm and brought them in single-handed." The other ranchers crowded into the small office, their expressions a mixture of amazement and skepticism. Questions flew rapid fire. How'd you find them when the posse couldn't even keep the trail? You went after armed men alone? Are my horses among the ones recovered? Eleanor weathered the barrage with the same calm composure she'd maintained throughout the ordeal. I recovered 4 horses from your ranch, Mr. Jennings. She addressed the most pressing question first. The distinctive thoroughbred with the white blaze and 3 of your draft horses. I believe the Miller brothers' stock is also among those returned. Jennings seemed unable to reconcile the soft-spoken widow who occasionally supplied horses for his ranch with the woman who had just accomplished what his hired men could not. But how did you... Perhaps this discussion could continue tomorrow, Eleanor interrupted gently but firmly. I've been on the trail for nearly 20 hours, and there's still work to be done. The main band of thieves remains at large with 6 of my horses, including my breeding stallion. Thompson nodded his agreement. Mrs. Blackwood's right. She's provided us with valuable intelligence on the remaining thieves' whereabouts and plans. We can organize a proper posse at first light. The ranchers reluctantly dispersed, though not without backward glances at Eleanor, their perceptions visibly shifting. As they filed out, Jennings lingered, straightening his dampened coat with unconscious dignity. Mrs. Blackwood, he began, clearly struggling with unfamiliar territory, it seems I've underestimated you. My apologies for my earlier skepticism. Eleanor acknowledged this with a slight nod. Your horses are safe, Mr. Jennings. That's what matters. After they'd gone, only Thompson, Reed, and Eleanor remained in the office. The awkward silence, broken only by occasional muttering from the cell, where the Briggs brothers conferred in low voices. You should get some rest, Thompson suggested, his tone gentler than his usual gruff manner. Rebecca's got a room ready for you above the doctor's office. Said you'd be needing it. Eleanor smiled faintly. Rebecca knows me too well. As she gathered her damp coat, Deputy Reed's youthful enthusiasm bubbled over again. Will you be leading the posse tomorrow, Mrs. Blackwood? With your tracking skills we could... No. Her response was immediate and firm, surprising both lawmen. I provided the information on Holloway's likely destination. That's sufficient. Reed's face fell in obvious disappointment. But you're the only one who... I work alone, Deputy. Eleanor's tone brooked no argument. I've already located and secured 2 of the thieves. The remaining operation is law enforcement's responsibility. Thompson studied her face, with the weathered wisdom of a man who recognized internal conflict when he saw it. Is that Eleanor Blackwood talking, or Eleanor Reynolds? The question struck with precise accuracy, and Eleanor's composed mask slipped. Momentarily, in the shadow of her eyes, both men glimpsed the struggle beneath, the woman who had built a quiet life against the tracker who had once hunted the territory's most dangerous quarry. Good night, Marshal. Deputy. With quiet dignity, she stepped into the rain-washed night, leaving the question unanswered. The storm had passed, leaving Pinecrest's main street slick with mud and pooled water that reflected the lamplight from the few buildings still illuminated at this late hour. Eleanor paused on the marshal's porch, her eyes automatically scanning the darkness with the habitual wariness of someone who had learned harsh lessons about vulnerability. Instead of heading directly to Rebecca's clinic, her feet carried her toward the livery stable where the recovered horses were being kept. The large building stood dark and quiet at the edge of town, but as she approached, a figure stepped from the shadows of a neighboring structure. Mrs. Blackwood, Dr. Rebecca. Wilson said softly, I thought I might find you checking on the horses before you'd allow yourself to rest. Eleanor didn't bother denying it, just making sure they're secure. Rebecca fell into step beside her friend, their boots making soft, squelching sounds in the mud. The entire town's talking about what you did today. You've become something of a legend in the span of a few hours. Precisely what I've spent 7 years avoiding, Eleanor replied, her voice tinged with weariness. They reached the stable doors, finding them securely latched but not locked. Eleanor frowned at this oversight and produced a small key from her vest pocket, the spare she'd been given years ago when she'd first started boarding horses occasionally at the town livery. Inside, the familiar sense of hay, horse and leather enveloped them in comfortable darkness. Eleanor moved unerringly to the lantern hanging by the door and lit it with practiced motions, casting a warm glow through the spacious interior. The recovered horses nickered softly in recognition as she moved down the central aisle, checking each stall. She paused at Jennings' thoroughbred, running a gentle hand down its sleek neck. "They seem well enough," Rebecca observed. "No serious injuries from their ordeal." "Holloway knows horses," Eleanor said, her voice holding reluctant professional respect. "He wouldn't damage valuable merchandise." Rebecca leaned against a support post, watching her friend's methodical inspection. "Thompson knows who you are. He suspects. He doesn't know everything." Eleanor moved to the next stall, checking the Miller brothers' stocky quarter horse for any overlooked injuries. "And he's agreed to maintain the fiction of Eleanor Blackwood, at least officially." And unofficially, when Eleanor didn't immediately respond, Rebecca pressed further. "Eleanor, the town already sees you differently. You can't return to anonymity now, even if Thompson keeps your secrets." Eleanor completed her circuit of the stalls before turning to face her friend, the lantern light casting her features in stark relief, highlighting both the strength and the weariness etched there. "7 years, Rebecca," she said quietly. 7 years building a life where I'm not defined by my abilities, where every success doesn't carry the weight of potential failure, where I don't have to live with the constant reminder that people's lives depend on whether I can read a bent blade of grass correctly. "Is that really why you walked away?" Rebecca asked gently. "Or was it because of David?" Eleanor's posture stiffened, the name striking a still raw nerve. "I led him to his death at Blackrock Pass. My confidence, my certainty that I could attract anyone, it got him killed. And the man responsible is still out there," Rebecca observed, "with your horses." The simple statement hung between them like a challenge. "Marshal Thompson will organize a posse," Eleanor said, though her tone lacked conviction. "They have the information they need to find Holloway's camp." Rebecca's expression was skeptical. "And you believe a group of ranchers and townsmen can apprehend a former military officer and his trained men who nearly killed you once before? What would you have me do?" Eleanor's voice carried a rare edge of frustration. "Return to the life I left behind? Become again the person who puts others at risk through overconfidence?" "I would have you be who you truly are," Rebecca answered simply, "not the shadow you've been living as." Eleanor extinguished the lantern, plunging the stable back into darkness. That felt suddenly oppressive rather than comforting. "You don't understand what you're asking," she said, her voice low but intense. "The person I was, the tracker, the hunter, she carries responsibilities I walked away from for good reasons." "Perhaps," Rebecca conceded, as they stepped back into the night air. "But from where I stand, it looks less like you walked away from responsibility and more like you've been hiding from yourself." Eleanor secured the stable door with methodical precision, her actions automatic, while her mind churned with the unwelcome truths Rebecca had laid before her. "My horses are still out there," she finally said, as though speaking the thought aloud might help resolve her internal conflict. "Cloudwalker especially. He's more than just property to me. And Holloway is more than just another horse thief. To you," Rebecca added perceptively. "He's the unfinished business you've been running from for 7 years. They paused at the crossroads where they would separate, Rebecca to her clinic, Eleanor to the room prepared for her above it. The town had fallen silent, most citizens long since retired for the night, unaware of the drama unfolding in their quiet community. "Whatever you decide," Rebecca said, squeezing Eleanor's arm gently, "remember, that running away didn't heal what was broken at Black Rock Pass. Perhaps facing it will. As Rebecca departed, Eleanor remained at the crossroads, both literally and figuratively. The town stretched to her right, civilization, safety, the identity she'd carefully constructed. To her left lay the wilderness, the trail leading to Holloway, and her stolen horses and the person she'd once been. The rain had cleared the air, leaving the night sky brilliant with stars that seemed to bear witness to her decision. In their cold, distant light, Eleanor Blackwood stood poised between past and present, between the safety of denial and the risk of reclaiming her true self. And somewhere in the darkness beyond Pinecrest, Victor Holloway waited with her horses, unaware that his old nemesis was now faced with a choice that would determine whether their unfinished business would finally reach its conclusion. Sleep eluded Eleanor as she lay in Rebecca's spare room, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling. The bed was comfortable enough, certainly more so than the forest floor where she'd spent countless nights during her tracking years. But comfort wasn't what kept her awake. It was the memories, long suppressed, that now surged forward like floodwaters breaching a dam. She rose silently and moved to the window, gazing out at Pinecrest's moonlit main street. The town slumbered peacefully, unaware of the storm raging. Within the woman they'd known only as the quiet widow who bred exceptional horses. Now that carefully constructed identity was unraveling, threads of her true self emerged, despite her efforts to keep them contained. Eleanor reached into her vest pocket and withdrew the silver medallion she'd carried for 2 decades, the symbol of her service with the Army Scout Corps. She rarely looked at it anymore, the weight of its presence usually burden enough. Tonight, she traced its worn edges, remembering the day Grey Wolf had placed it in her hand. "You see what others cannot?" the old Nez Perce scout had told her. "That is both a gift and a responsibility." A gift. That's how it had begun. Her uncanny ability to read sign, where others saw nothing but wilderness. Orphaned at 8, when influenza swept through her missionary parents' outpost, she'd been adopted by Grey Wolf out of respect for her father's fair dealings with the tribe. Under his patient tutelage, what had started as a child's game of following animal tracks had evolved into something extraordinary. By 15, she could track deer through rockfields that left no visible sign to the untrained eye. By 18, she was following human quarries across 5 types of terrain with unfailing accuracy. When the army realized what the old scout and his adopted daughter could do, they offered them positions as civilian trackers, generous wages for skills that had become increasingly rare as the frontier changed. For 10 years they'd worked together, building a reputation that bordered on mythical. The Shadow Walkers, some soldiers called them. The trackers who could follow you through hell itself if ordered. They specialized in finding deserters, retrieving stolen military property, and occasionally rescuing lost patrols or settlers. It was during one such mission that she'd met David Reynolds, a young lieutenant with kind eyes and a quick mind. Unlike other officers who treated scouts, especially female ones, with barely concealed disdain, David had shown genuine interest in her methods. Their professional respect had blossomed into friendship, then love. Their marriage had raised eyebrows in both military and native circles, but Grey Wolf had approved, seeing in David a man who valued Eleanor for exactly who she was. For 3 years they'd worked as a team, Eleanor tracking, David commanding the small retrieval units that followed her lead. They'd been effective, successful, respected. Then came Black Rock Pass. The memory still had the power to steal her breath. Eleanor set down the medallion and pressed her palms against the cool glass of the window, anchoring herself in the present. A band of horse thieves had hit 3 military outposts in rapid succession, stealing prime cavalry mounts and weaponry. Led by a recently discharged captain named Victor Holloway, they'd employed military tactics that made them far more dangerous than ordinary outlaws. After their third successful raid left 2 guards dead, Eleanor and David had been assigned to track them. The trail had been challenging, but not impossible. Eleanor had followed it for 6 days, through terrain specifically chosen to confuse pursuit. Holloway had employed every counter-tracking technique in the military handbook, but Eleanor had countered each one, closing the distance steadily. On the 7th day, they'd tracked the thieves to Black Rock Pass, a narrow defile between towering cliffs. Eleanor had read the sign, noted the unusual pattern of horse droppings and displaced stones. She'd sensed something wrong, but had dismissed her intuition in favor of the clear evidence before her. The tracks led directly into the pass. The thieves were just ahead. "It doesn't feel right," she'd told David. "The sign is too obvious, almost like they want us to follow," he'd finished, sharing her concern. But their orders had been clear: retrieve the stolen horses and apprehend the thieves. After brief consultation, they'd decided to proceed with caution, David riding point with Eleanor slightly behind, reading the trail as they advanced. The ambush had been sprung with military precision. Shots had echoed through the narrow pass, bullets ricocheting off stone walls. David had fallen first, without even a cry of warning. Eleanor had taken a bullet to the shoulder, her horse shot out from under her. Only her instinctive drive behind a boulder had saved her from the follow-up volley. For nearly an hour, she'd lay trapped, bleeding, listening to Holloway and his men discuss whether to finish her off or leave her to die slowly. In the end, a gathering storm had decided them. They'd mounted up and departed, taking both the stolen horses and those belonging to Eleanor and David's party. Through a haze of pain and grief, she'd heard Holloway's parting words. "Let the famous tracker find her own way home. If she survives, she'll have learnt a valuable lesson about following me." 3 days later, delirious with infection and dehydration, she'd stumbled into a military outpost. Physical recovery had taken weeks. Explaining David's death had taken longer. The official report cited tactical miscalculation and insufficient reconnaissance, bloodless phrases that placed the blame squarely on Eleanor's tracking decisions. Grey Wolf had defended her fiercely, but the damage was done. Her reputation, once near legendary, was tarnished by the failure. More devastating than the professional setback was her own crushing guilt. She'd led her husband and 4 soldiers into that ambush. Her confidence in her abilities, her certainty that she could outwit any quarry, had cost 5 lives. She couldn't forgive herself for that arrogance, that fatal overconfidence. Within a month of her recovery, she'd resigned her position. Grey Wolf had understood her decision, though he'd disagreed with it. "Running from pain doesn't heal it," he'd told her. "It only changes its shape." She'd changed more than her location. She'd changed her name, her appearance, her entire way of being in the world. Eleanor Reynolds, the celebrated tracker, had disappeared. Eleanor Blackwood, the widow, had emerged in her place, quiet, reserved, determined to live a life where no one else's safety depended on her judgment. For 7 years, she'd maintained that separation, using her tracking skills only for harmless purposes, finding strayed livestock or lost children. She'd deliberately cultivated a persona of quiet competence rather than exceptional ability. She'd focused on breeding horses, an occupation that allowed her to remain somewhat solitary without raising suspicions. And it had worked, until Holloway had unwittingly stolen horses from the very tracker he'd once defeated. A soft knock at the door interrupted her reverie. Eleanor quickly pocketed the medallion and composed her features before opening it. Rebecca stood in the hallway, fully dressed despite the late hour, holding a steaming mug. "I thought you might still be awake," the doctor said. "Chamomile tea, good for restless minds." Eleanor accepted the offering with a grateful nod, stepping back to allow her friend entry. "Your hospitality extends well beyond medical care." Rebecca settled into the room's single chair, studying Eleanor with the penetrating gaze that had likely unsettled many patients over the years. "I had a visitor after you retired. Marshal Thompson came by officially to check if you needed medical attention after your ordeal. Unofficially, he wanted to confirm his suspicions about my identity." Eleanor finished, sipping the tea. Rebecca nodded. "He's been more observant than his drinking habits would suggest. Apparently, your name has been mentioned in certain military circles for years. The tracker who vanished after Black Rock Pass." Eleanor stiffened slightly. "What did you tell him?" "The truth. That my patient's name is Eleanor Blackwood. And I'm bound by confidentiality regarding anything else I might know." Rebecca's expression softened. "But he left something for you. Said it might help you make your decision about tomorrow." She produced a folded piece of paper from her pocket and handed it to Eleanor, who opened it cautiously. Inside was a newspaper clipping, yellowed with age. The headline read, "Notorious Horse Thief Escapes Military Custody." The brief article detailed how Victor Holloway, arrested for stealing military property and suspected in the deaths of 6 soldiers, had escaped while being transported to Fort Walla Walla for trial. The final paragraph noted that Holloway had sworn vengeance against those responsible for his capture, particularly the military tracker who had initially identified him. "Thompson believes Holloway doesn't know you're here," Rebecca explained. "He thinks the theft of your horses was coincidental, but if Holloway realizes who you are—" Eleanor carefully refolded the clipping. "He'd come after me directly, finish what he started at Black Rock Pass, which means you have a choice," Rebecca said gently. "Stay hidden as Eleanor Blackwood and let the posse handle Holloway, potentially leading more men into an ambush." Eleanor interjected grimly. "Or reclaim who you truly are," Rebecca finished. "The tracker who might be the only person capable of anticipating Holloway's tactics and bringing him to justice." Eleanor moved back to the window, gazing out at the darkened landscape beyond. Pinecrest. Somewhere in those hills, 6 of her horses remained captive, along with the man who had haunted her nightmares for 7 years. "It's not that simple," she said finally. "Tracking Holloway again means risking the same overconfidence. That got David killed. What if I lead another group into disaster?" Rebecca rose and joined her at the window. "From what Thompson tells me, the Eleanor Reynolds he heard about never made the same mistake twice. She learned, adapted, grew more careful with experience." She placed a supportive hand on Eleanor's arm. "Perhaps the real question isn't whether you risk becoming that person again, but whether you ever truly stopped being her." The insight struck with uncomfortable precision. Despite 7 years of careful disguise, the core of who she was had never changed. Each time she'd tracked a lost child or strayed animal, each time she'd read signs that others couldn't see, she'd remained the tracker Grey Wolf had trained, only operating within self-imposed limitations. "There's something else to consider," Rebecca added quietly. "If Holloway reaches Montana territory with your horses, he disappears forever. Your Appaloosa stallion, the breeding program you've spent years developing, will be lost." Eleanor's jaw tightened. Cloudwalker represented more than monetary value. He was the cornerstone of her new life, the future she'd been building since walking away from her past. "The posse leaves at first light," Rebecca continued. "Thompson's leading it himself, despite his age and condition. They'll follow your directions to Devil's Gulch, but we both know what they'll find. An empty camp," Eleanor concluded with certainty. "Holloway won't stay there once he realizes his ambush failed. He'll take an alternate route, probably through Serpent Ridge if he's moving. Horses in a hurry." "Which no one but you would know," Rebecca pointed out. "No one but you could track him through that terrain." Eleanor was silent for a long moment, weighing more than just tactical considerations. This wasn't simply about recovering stolen property, or even confronting Holloway. It was about whether she would continue running from her past, or finally face it. Grey Wolf used to say that a true tracker doesn't just follow sign, she said softly. They become the sign, part of the story written. On the land, Rebecca waited, recognizing the significance of Eleanor sharing this piece of her past. For 7 years I've been trying to erase my own sign, Eleanor continued. But perhaps some trails can't be obscured, no matter how carefully we try. She turned from the window, decision forming in her eyes. I need to check my equipment, and I'll need supplies enough for 3 days in the mountains. You've decided then? Rebecca asked. Yes. Eleanor's voice carried a quiet conviction that had been absent earlier. Eleanor Blackwood will join Thompson's posse tomorrow as a concerned horse owner, but it will be Eleanor Reynolds who tracks Holloway. The distinction was subtle, but significant, an acknowledgement that her two identities might no longer need to remain so rigidly separated. What changed your mind? Rebecca inquired. Eleanor considered the question carefully before answering. 7 years ago, I failed because I was tracking with pride, trying to prove I was the best. Tomorrow, I'll be tracking with purpose, to recover what's mine and prevent Holloway from harming anyone else. She met her friend's gaze directly. The motivation matters as much as the skill. Rebecca nodded in understanding. I'll have supplies ready for you before dawn. And Eleanor, she hesitated briefly. Whatever happens, remember that tracking Holloway isn't just about facing your past. It's about reclaiming your future. As Rebecca departed, Eleanor returned to her medallion, running her thumb over the worn silver surface one last time, before placing it deliberately on the bedside table where she could see it. No longer a hidden reminder of failure, but a visible symbol of the skills she would need in the coming days. Outside, the moon slipped behind clouds, casting Pinecrest into a deeper shadow. In that darkness, Eleanor began her preparations, checking her tracking glasses, examining maps, mentally calculating routes and water sources. Each methodical action felt like removing a layer of disguise, revealing the tracker who had existed beneath the widow's careful facade all along. By the time false dawn lightened the eastern sky, Eleanor Reynolds was ready to hunt again. Dawn painted the eastern sky in streaks of amber and gold as Pinecrest's main street filled with mounted men. The posse, 15 strong, represented nearly every able-bodied male in the small community, armed with an assortment of rifles, shotguns, and determination. Marshal Thompson sat astride his aging dun-gelding at their head, looking more alert than he had in years, his badge freshly polished and prominently displayed on his chest. Eleanor approached Rebecca's borrowed paint, drawing curious glances from the assembled men. She'd dressed practically for the expedition. Canvas pants, sturdy boots, and a deerskin jacket that had remained hidden in her cabin's storage chest for 7 years. A Winchester rifle rested in her saddle scabbard, while her saddlebags bulged with tracking equipment carefully concealed beneath ordinary provisions. Mrs. Blackwood, Thompson acknowledged her with a respectful nod that carried subtle recognition of who she truly was. Didn't expect you'd be joining us. My horses are still out there, Marshal, she replied evenly. I have as much right as anyone to participate in their recovery. Jennings, mounted on a magnificent sorrel, frowned at her presence. This isn't a social outing, Mrs. Blackwood. We're pursuing dangerous men. I'm well aware of the danger, Mr. Jennings. Eleanor's voice remained calm, though a hint of steel underlay her words. And I'm also aware that those men are holed up in terrain most of you have never traversed. Deputy Reed, eager as always, rode forward. Mrs. Blackwood tracked and captured the Briggs brothers single-handed, he reminded the group. I'd say that earns her a place with us. Thompson raised a hand to forestall further discussion. Mrs. Blackwood has provided valuable information on the thieves' location. Her participation is welcome. His gaze met Eleanor's briefly. "Though I trust she understands this is a law enforcement operation, not a personal vendetta." Eleanor inclined, her head slightly, acknowledging the subtle warning. "My only interest is in recovering my property, Marshal." As the posse organized itself for departure, Eleanor maneuvered her mount toward the rear of the group. Her plan was clear: maintain the appearance of cooperation while preserving her freedom to break away when the inevitable happened. Holloway wouldn't be at Devil's Gulch. She was certain of it. Once the posse discovered the abandoned camp, she would track the actual escape route while the others debated their next move. They departed Pinecrest as the sun created the eastern mountains, a formidable show of frontier justice that drew the remaining townspeople onto their porches to watch. Among them stood Rebecca, who raised a hand in silent salute as Eleanor passed. The gesture conveyed both support and concern. The doctor understood better than most what this journey truly meant. For the first several miles, Eleanor rode silently, allowing Thompson to lead, as the posse followed the most direct route toward Devil's Gulch. She noted with professional interest that the marshal had positioned scouts on both flanks, a precaution that spoke of his military background and suggested his drinking hadn't entirely dulled his tactical mind. As they entered denser forest, Eleanor found herself riding alongside a rancher named Wilson, a quiet man whose weathered face suggested decades of frontier life. "Been watching you, Mrs. Blackwood," he said without preamble. "Where you study the ground, check the wind, not the habits of an ordinary horse breeder." Eleanor maintained her composure, though internally she noted that her careful disguise was unraveling more rapidly than anticipated. "Living alone teaches you to be observant, Mr. Wilson." "Reckon it does," he agreed amiably. "My wife's cousin served at Fort Walla Walla years back. Used to tell stories about an army tracker who could follow a ghost through fog. Never mentioned it was a woman, though." He glanced at her sidelong. "Folks have their reasons for starting fresh. It's not my business to question them." Before Eleanor could respond to this oblique acknowledgement of her past, a shout from the forward scout interrupted their conversation. "Rider coming fast, Marshal, from the northwest." The posse immediately tensed, rifles shifting to ready positions as Thompson signaled for them to form a defensive line across the trail. Eleanor nudged her mount slightly forward, positioned to observe without drawing attention. The approaching rider materialized from the forest at a dangerous gallop, a young man on a lathered horse that showed signs of being pushed beyond endurance. As he neared the posse, Eleanor recognized Mason Parker, the youngest member of Holloway's gang. "Hold it right there," Thompson commanded, his rifle leveled. Parker reined his exhausted mount to a skidding halt, raising his hands to show he was unarmed. His face was pale beneath trail dust, and a bandage wrapped hastily around his left forearm showed blood stains seeping through. "Marshal Thompson?" he called, his voice cracking with strain. "Thank God. You gotta help us. They've gone crazy, killing everyone." Thompson kept his rifle steady. "Who's gone crazy, son?" "The Blackfoot," Parker responded, eyes wide with what appeared to be genuine terror. "They hit our camp at dawn. Holloway, Curtis, Reyes, all dead. I barely got away." A ripple of concern passed through the posse. Blackfoot raids, while rare this far west, represented a threat that even well-armed men treated with appropriate fear. Several posse members exchanged uneasy glances, clearly recalculating the risk of their mission. Eleanor studied Parker with narrowed eyes, noting details that others might miss: the pattern of dust on his clothing, the nature of his horse's fatigue, the specific wrap of his bandage. Something wasn't right. "Where exactly was this attack?" Thompson demanded, maintaining his professional demeanor despite the alarming news. "Devil's Gulch," Parker replied quickly. "We were camped at the old mining operation. They came out of nowhere, dozens of them. I've been riding for hours, trying to find help." Jennings moved his horse forward. "Marshal, If there's a Blackfoot war party in the area, we need to alert the territory. This changes everything." Eleanor nudged her mount alongside Thompson's, speaking quietly enough that only he could hear. "He's lying, Marshal. The Blackfoot haven't raided this far west in over a decade, and his wound isn't from an arrow or lance. That's a bullet graze." Thompson's eyes flickered toward her momentarily, then back to Parker. "Son, why don't you dismount nice and slow? We'll tend that arm of yours while you tell us exactly what happened." Parker's demeanor shifted subtly, the fear in his eyes hardening into calculation. "No time for that, Marshal. There are wounded men back there who need help. We should hurry before—" "Before what?" Thompson interrupted. "Before we realize there's no Blackfoot war party. Before we ride straight into whatever trap Holloway's set for us." Parker's hand moved with unexpected speed toward his boot, but Thompson was faster. The Marshal's rifle cracked sharply, and Parker tumbled from his saddle with a cry of pain, clutching his shoulder. "Check him for weapons," Thompson ordered, as two posse members dismounted to secure the wounded man. They found a small derringer in his boot and a knife sheathed at his back. More tellingly, they discovered a folded map marked with an X at a location miles from Devil's Gulch, a spot Eleanor immediately recognized as Serpent Ridge. "Just as I suspected," Thompson said grimly. "He was trying to lead us away from Holloway's actual escape route." Parker, now securely bound and seated against a tree, glared at them with mingled fear and defiance. "You've signed your own death warrants," he spat. "The captain planned for every contingency." Eleanor dismounted and crouched before the captured man, studying his face with the same attention she might give to complex tracking signs. "Where are my horses, Mason? Especially the Appaloosa stallion?" Recognition flickered in Parker's eyes. "You're the widow." He laughed bitterly. "Lady, your horses are probably halfway to Montana by now. The captain took a special liking to that Appaloosa, though. Said it reminded him of army stock." "Because it is," Eleanor confirmed quietly. "Descended from the Nez Perce breeding program. The same program that produced the horses your boss stole 7 years ago at Black Rock Pass." Parker's expression shifted from defiance to confusion. "What are you talking about?" "Ask your captain about a tracker named Reynolds," Eleanor suggested, her voice carrying an edge that made several nearby posse members look at her with sudden wariness. "Ask him what happened the last time he stole the wrong horses." Before Parker could respond, Thompson intervened. "Mrs. Blackwood, a word, please." He led her several paces away, pitching his voice low to avoid being overheard. "You're baiting him, trying to send a message to Holloway." It wasn't a question, and Eleanor didn't bother denying it. "Holloway needs to know who's tracking him." "Is that wise?" Thompson challenged. "If he realizes Eleanor Reynolds is on his trail, won't that just make him more dangerous?" "He's already dangerous," Eleanor countered, "but now he'll be rattled. Men make mistakes when they're rattled." Thompson studied her face, clearly seeing beyond the widow's facade to the experienced tracker beneath. "You're not planning to stay with the posse, are you?" Eleanor met his gaze directly. "You know as well as I do that Holloway is headed for Serpent Ridge. That route requires an experienced guide for a single rider, let alone someone moving stolen horses. If I follow the main trails with 15 men, we'll never catch him. And if you go alone, then I track him the way I should have 7 years ago, carefully, patiently, without overconfidence." Thompson considered this, then nodded reluctantly. "What do you need from us?" "Continue to Devil's Gulch as planned," Eleanor instructed. "Holloway will have left misleading sign for you to follow. Spend time investigating the site. Make it obvious you're searching the area. Meanwhile, I'll pick up their actual trail and track them towards Serpent Ridge." "And when you find them," Thompson pressed, "these aren't just ordinary horse thieves, Mrs. Blackwood. They're killers." Eleanor's expression hardened. "So was the war party that killed my parents. So were the renegades I tracked for the army for 15 years. I'm not going in blind or unprepared. After a moment's hesitation, Thompson reached inside his coat and withdrew a deputy marshal's badge. Territory law allows me to deputize civilians in emergency situations. This might help if things go sideways. Eleanor stared at the offered badge, understanding its significance. It represented not just legal authority, but Thompson's acknowledgement of who she truly was. His validation of Eleanor Reynolds alongside Eleanor Blackwood. "I work better unofficially," she said, gently declining the badge. "But I appreciate the gesture, Marshal." Thompson returned the badge to his pocket. "How will you break away without alerting the others? Jennings in particular won't take kindly to you striking out alone." Eleanor smiled faintly. "I disappeared from Army scouts who were specifically watching for me. Slipping away from ranchers and townsmen won't pose much challenge." They rejoined the main group, where Parker was being secured to a spare horse for transport. The young outlaw watched Eleanor with new wariness, clearly unsettled by her reference to Black Rock Pass. "What do we do now, Marshal?" Jennings demanded. "Continue to Devil's Gulch, or follow this new lead to Serpent Ridge?" Thompson mounted his horse with the deliberate movements of a man making a show of consideration. "We stick to the original plan. Devil's Gulch first. We need to verify this man's story one way or another. If Holloway and the others are truly dead, we need to recover Mrs. Blackwood's horses. If not, we'll find signs of where they've gone." This compromise satisfied the posse, and they resumed their journey with renewed determination, Parker secured in their midst. Eleanor fell back to her position at the rear, mentally calculating the point where she would separate from the group. A small creek crossing 3 miles ahead would provide the perfect opportunity. The rocky terrain would mask her departure, while the noise of 15 horses crossing water would cover any sound she might make. As they rode, Eleanor found herself watching Parker, noting how the young outlaw's eyes darted nervously from rider to rider before repeatedly returning to her. Whatever Holloway had told his men about Black Rock Pass clearly hadn't included the identity of the tracker involved. Parker's growing agitation suggested he recognized the potential significance of Eleanor's reference. When they paused briefly to rest the horses, Parker managed to maneuver his mount close enough to Eleanor to speak without being overheard by the others. "Who are you, really?" he asked, his youthful face unable to mask his confusion. "The way you talk about the captain—" "You know him." Eleanor checked her saddle girth, her movements unhurried despite the charged nature of the conversation. "I knew him when he wore a uniform and had honor," she replied evenly, "before he became a thief and a murderer." "Lady, you're making a mistake," Parker warned, his voice low but urgent. "The captain isn't someone you want as an enemy. If you're who I think you are, he's told stories about a tracker from his army days. Said if that person ever caught up with him, only one of them would walk away." "He's right about that," Eleanor agreed, her calm certainty more unnerving than any threat could have been. Parker swallowed hard. "He's got men watching all the approaches to Serpent Ridge. You'll never get close without being spotted." Eleanor finished adjusting her saddle and turned to face the young outlaw directly. 7 years ago, your boss left me for dead on a mountainside with a bullet in my shoulder. I tracked him for 6 days before that happened. I've spent the intervening years becoming better at what I do, not worse." She held his gaze steadily. "Tell Holloway that Eleanor Reynolds is coming for her horses, and this time I won't be following obvious sign." The blood drained from Parker's face at the name. Whatever Holloway had told his men about Eleanor Reynolds had clearly left an impression. "You're dead," he whispered. "The captain said you died at Black Rock Pass." "Another of his mistakes," Eleanor replied simply, turning away as Thompson called for the posse to resume their journey. As they approached the creek crossing that would mark her departure point, Eleanor felt a strange calm settling over her. For 7 years, she'd hidden from her true nature, convinced that Eleanor Reynolds was a danger to herself and others. Now, facing the man who had caused that self-doubt, she was reclaiming not just her identity, but her confidence. The hollow scar that stretched across her left shoulder, Holloway's parting gift from Blackrock Pass, seemed to ache with renewed purpose. Ahead lay not just stolen horses, but unfinished business that had haunted her for 7 years. Behind lay the safe but incomplete life she'd constructed as Eleanor Blackwood. The creek came into view, sunlight dancing off its surface. As it tumbled over moss-covered stones, Eleanor allowed herself one last glance at the posse, good men doing their best to enforce justice in a harsh land. Then, as the first riders splashed into the crossing, she quietly reined her mount aside and melted into the forest like the Ghost Thompson had once described. Eleanor Reynolds was hunting again. Serpent Ridge earned its name honestly. The narrow path wound along a precipitous mountainside, twisting back on itself like a serpent in motion, offering spectacular views to those brave enough to traverse it, and deadly falls to those who misjudged its treacherous footing. Few local guides would lead travelers along its length, especially with horses, preferring the longer but safer passes to the east. Eleanor crouched on an outcropping half a mile from the ridge entrance, studying the terrain through her field glasses. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the landscape, highlighting details that would be invisible to less experienced eyes. 3 hours had passed since she'd separated from Thompson's posse, during which she'd confirmed her suspicions about Holloway's escape route through a series of subtle signs. Branches broken at horseman's height, distinctive wear patterns where horseshoes had struck stone, and the occasional horse droppings meticulously covered but still detectable to someone with her training. What troubled her was the precision of the trail. Holloway was deliberately leaving just enough sign for someone of her abilities to follow, not obvious enough for ordinary trackers, but clear enough for someone with her specialized training. The implications were unsettling. Either he still believed Eleanor Reynolds was dead and was simply being cautious, or he somehow knew she was following and was laying a trail specifically for her. The latter possibility sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the mountain air. If Holloway knew she was tracking him, every sign she followed could be leading her into another ambush. Eleanor shifted position, scanning the ridge methodically. There, a flash of metal caught the sunlight briefly before disappearing. She adjusted, her glasses focusing on the spot. A man positioned behind a boulder at the ridge's narrowest point, rifle barrel momentarily exposed before being pulled back into shadow. Another scan revealed a second watcher farther along the path, this one better concealed among scrub pine but betrayed by the irregular pattern of the branches concealing him. 2 sentries that I can see, she murmured to herself, making mental notes of their positions. Probably more I can't. Holloway was indeed expecting pursuit, and he'd prepared accordingly. Any frontal approach along the ridge would be suicidal, exposing the pursuer to fire from multiple elevated positions with no cover available on the narrow path. Eleanor withdrew from her observation point with the same silent efficiency that had allowed her to approach undetected. She retreated to where she'd secured her horse in a small copse, the animal contentedly grazing on mountain grass, while waiting impatiently for her return. "Good boy," she murmured, stroking the gelding's neck affectionately. The paint wasn't her missing thunder, but he was proving to be a reliable mount, with the steady temperament needed for tracking work. She removed her canteen from the saddle, drinking sparingly while considering her options. The direct approach was clearly impossible. Attempting to outflank the sentries would require circling miles around the ridge through dangerous terrain, potentially losing Holloway's trail in the process. Waiting for Thompson and the posse would mean surrendering the element of surprise and increasing the risk to others. None of these alternatives appealed to her tactical sense. What she needed was a third option, something Holloway wouldn't anticipate. Eleanor reached into her saddlebag and withdrew her leather-bound journal, flipping to pages containing detailed maps she'd drawn of the surrounding mountains over the past 7 years. The official territorial maps showed Serpent Ridge as the only passage through this section of the range, but her explorations had revealed something the cartographers had missed: a seasonal game trail used by mountain goats that traversed the cliff face below the main ridge. She discovered it 5 years earlier while tracking a lost child, noting how the goats navigated what appeared to be an impassable route. Following their lead, she'd mapped a treacherous but viable path that ran parallel to the ridge, invisible from above. It wasn't suitable for horses, but a person on foot could make the crossing with sufficient caution. "That's it," she whispered, tracing the route with her finger. If she left her horse secured here and proceeded on foot, she could bypass Holloway's sentries entirely, emerging on the far side of the ridge where he'd least expect pursuit. The plan crystallized in her mind. She would take only essential tracking and survival equipment, cross the lower path before nightfall, and intercept Holloway's group at the valley beyond. The risk was considerable. A single misstep on the narrow ledges would mean certain death. But it was the one approach Holloway couldn't possibly have prepared for, since the trail didn't appear on any maps, and few locals even knew of its existence. Eleanor began methodically transferring essential items from her saddlebags to a small pack she could carry on her back. Her Winchester rifle would be too cumbersome for the treacherous crossing, so she opted instead for her Colt revolver, secured in a shoulder holster beneath her jacket. She added her tracking glasses, compass, canteen, minimal provisions, and a coil of lightweight rope. As she prepared, Eleanor found herself unconsciously falling into the pre-mission rituals she'd developed during her years with the army, checking each item twice, mentally rehearsing contingencies, centering herself through measured breathing. They were the habits of Eleanor Reynolds, not Eleanor Blackwood, yet they felt natural now, like reclaiming a part of herself that had never truly disappeared. The sun was beginning its westward descent when she completed her preparations. She secured her horse with enough slack to reach grass and water, patting his neck with a promise to return. If all went as planned, she would rejoin the animal the following afternoon, hopefully with information on Holloway's precise location and her stolen horse's condition. Before departing, Eleanor removed the silver medallion from her pocket, the symbol of her service with the Army Scout Corps that she'd carried for so many years. She studied it briefly, tracing the worn engravings with her thumb. For 7 years, it had been a reminder of failure and loss. Now, as she prepared to face the man responsible for that pain, the medallion seemed to carry a different weight. After a moment's contemplation, instead of returning it to her pocket, she slipped the chain over her head, letting the medallion rest against her chest beneath her shirt. The gesture felt significant, a conscious reclaiming of her identity rather than a burden of memory. The approach to the hidden trail required descending a steep ravine filled with loose shale, treacherous footing that demanded her complete attention. Eleanor moved with practiced care, testing each step before committing her weight, using trees and outcroppings for balance. By the time she reached the actual game trail, sweat dampened her shirt despite the cool mountain air. The path itself was barely 18 inches wide in places, a natural ledge that followed the contours of the cliff face 50 feet below the main ridge. From above, it was virtually invisible, shadowed by overhangs and disguised by the mountains. Striated geology. From below, it appeared as merely another horizontal feature in the complex face of the cliff. Eleanor paused at the trail entrance, surveying the route ahead. A fall from here wouldn't be survivable. The narrow path stretched around the mountain's curve, disappearing from sight approximately a quarter-mile ahead. Crossing it would require absolute focus and steady nerves, qualities that had defined Eleanor Reynolds in her tracking days. As she prepared to step onto the trail, a moment of profound clarity swept through her. 7 years ago, after Black Rock, a pass, she had walked away from tracking not just because of guilt over David's death, but because of fear. Fear that her confidence had been misplaced, that her abilities weren't as exceptional as she'd believed. In creating Eleanor Blackwood, she had constructed a person who never had to test those limits, never had to risk discovery that she might be merely ordinary after all. Now, facing a literal precipice that mirrored her psychological one, Eleanor realized the choice before her went beyond recovering stolen horses or confronting Holloway. This moment demanded she decide once and for all. Was she the cautious widow who bred horses in Elk Valley, or was she the tracker whose abilities had become legendary in military circles? A gust of wind swirled around her, carrying the scent of pine and distant snow. The mountains seemed to be waiting for her decision. "I am Eleanor Reynolds," she spoke aloud, the words carrying surprising power. "And I am Eleanor Blackwood. They are not separate people, but parts of the same whole." With that declaration, acknowledgement rather than choice, she stepped onto the narrow ledge, moving with the balanced confidence that had once been her hallmark. The familiar focus settled over her as she navigated the treacherous path. Each step precisely placed, each handhold carefully tested. The fear remained, not of the precipitous drop, but of failure. Yet now she recognized it not as weakness, but as wisdom, the caution that had always balanced her confidence. An hour into the crossing, the path narrowed further, requiring her to press her back against the cliff face and edge sideways across a particularly exposed section. Far below, jagged rocks waited impassively, while above, the ridge where Holloway's sentries watches for pursuit remained oblivious to her passage beneath them. Eleanor breathed steadily, moving with the patience that Grey Wolf had instilled in her from childhood. "The mountain does not hurry," he'd often remind her, "neither should the tracker." Halfway across this dangerous stretch, a sudden sharp crack echoed from above. A rifle shot from the ridge. Eleanor froze, pressing herself against the rock face as voices carried down from the sentries' positions. "Just a mountain goat," one called to the other. "Thought it might be someone trying to circle around. Captain said nobody'd be fool enough to try this ridge anyway," the second voice replied. "But keep your eyes open. Parker should have delayed any pursuit, but the captain doesn't like surprises." Eleanor remained motionless until their conversation faded, then continued her careful progress. The exchange confirmed her suspicions. Holloway was indeed expecting pursuit, but he hadn't anticipated anyone knowing about this lower trail. His confidence would be his vulnerability, just as hers had been at Black Rock Pass. The sun dipped below the western peaks as Eleanor finally reached the far side of the dangerous crossing. The game trail widened as it descended toward a small alpine meadow nestled in the mountain's embrace, a natural resting place before the final descent into the valley beyond. Here, sheltered by towering pines, she could safely wait out the remaining daylight before continuing her approach under cover of darkness. As she settled into a concealed position beneath the spreading branches of an ancient pine, Eleanor removed her tracking glasses and studied the valley below. In the gathering dusk, campfire smoke rose from a location approximately 2 miles distant, likely Holloway's temporary camp. The terrain between her position and the camp offered excellent cover. Dense forest interspersed with massive boulders deposited by some ancient glacier. Eleanor allowed herself a moment of professional satisfaction. She had successfully circumvented Holloway's carefully planned defenses, placing herself in perfect position to observe his operation undetected. Now she could assess her stolen horses' condition, count Holloway's remaining men, and plan her next move accordingly. More importantly, she had navigated the treacherous game trail not as the cautious widow she'd pretended to be for 7 years, but as the confident tracker she truly was. The crossing had required every bit of skill and judgment she possessed, not the reckless overconfidence that had led to disaster at Blackrock Pass, but the measured expertise that had made her reputation in the first place. As darkness settled over the mountains, Eleanor finally acknowledged the truth that Rebecca had tried to help her see. She had never truly stopped being Eleanor Reynolds. The tracker's instincts, skills, and identity had remained within her, merely constrained by self-imposed limitations born of grief and guilt. Tomorrow she would confront not just Holloway, but the ghost of her past failures. She would do so not as two separate people at war within herself, but as the complete person she had always been, both the widow who valued peace and the tracker who pursued justice with relentless determination. In the deepening twilight, Eleanor removed her medallion and held it in her palm, the silver catching the last remnants of daylight. 7 years ago, she had carried it as a burden of remembrance. Tonight, as she prepared to face her greatest failure, it felt instead like a talisman of strength, a symbol not of what she had lost, but of what she had finally reclaimed. Eleanor Reynolds had returned, not replacing Eleanor Blackwood, but completing her. Tomorrow, Holloway would discover exactly what that meant. Long before dawn broke over the mountains, Eleanor was already on the move. She navigated through the darkness with a surety that seemed almost supernatural, her footfalls making no more sound than falling leaves. The quarter moon provided just enough illumination for her trained eyes to distinguish the subtle variations in the forest floor, while the stars above offered directional guidance as reliable as any compass. She approached Holloway's camp with the patient stalking technique Grey Wolf had taught her decades earlier, a careful advance and hold pattern that allowed her to detect sentry positions and avoid them. 2 men guarded the camp's perimeter, but their attention focused outward toward the main trails, not inward from the supposedly impassable ridge she had crossed. By the time the eastern sky began to lighten, Eleanor had worked her way to a position overlooking the camp from behind a massive fallen pine. From this vantage, she could observe the entire operation while remaining completely concealed. The camp itself was well organized, military discipline evident in its layout. 6 tents arranged in a precise half-circle faced a central fire pit, where the night's embers still glowed. A temporary corral had been constructed along the eastern edge, containing the stolen horses. Eleanor's pulse quickened as she counted. 11 animals, including her prized Appaloosa stallion, Cloudwalker, and her personal mount, Thunder. The horses appeared unharmed, though clearly fatigued from forced travel through difficult terrain. More concerning was Holloway's remaining force. She counted 7 men, including Holloway himself, more than she had anticipated after the capture. Of the Briggs brothers and Parker, 2 she recognized from her earlier observations, Curtis Walsh and Gabriel Reyes. The others were unfamiliar, likely newer recruits or hired guns brought in specifically for this operation. Eleanor settled into her observation post, drawing her field journal from her pack. With practiced efficiency, she sketched the camp layout, noting guard positions, weapons placements, and potential approaches. This wasn't just tracking anymore, it was tactical reconnaissance of the kind she'd conducted dozens of times during her army service. As dawn fully illuminated the valley, the camp stirred to life. Men emerged from tents, weapons close at hand, moving with the alert wariness of experienced outlaws. Holloway appeared last, emerging from the largest tent with the bearing of a military officer despite his civilian clothes. Even at this distance, Eleanor could see how the years had hardened him. His once handsome face now weathered and creased, the distinctive scar running from temple to jaw more pronounced than she remembered from wanted posters. She watched as he strode directly to the corral, his attention immediately focusing on Cloudwalker. Even from her concealed position, Eleanor could read the appreciation in his posture as he ran expert hands along the Appaloosa's powerful legs and assessed his conformation. The stallion, normally aggressive with strangers, seemed unusually tolerant of Holloway's examination, a testament to the man's genuine skill with horses. "This one's not for sale, Curtis," Holloway's voice carried, clearly in the mountain air. "Bloodlines like this don't come along often. He's the cornerstone of our new operation." Walsh approached, rifle slung casually over his shoulder. "Thought the plan was to sell everything to Sullivan in Montana, clean break afterward." "Plans evolve," Holloway replied, his tone brooking no argument. "This stallion alone could produce offspring worth 10 times what Sullivan would pay for him. The ranch we've secured in Idaho will need foundation stock." Their conversation continued, revealing details of an operation more extensive than Eleanor had realized. This wasn't just an opportunistic theft. It was part of a calculated plan to establish a legitimate horse breeding operation using stolen bloodstock. Cloudwalker, with his exceptional Nez Perce lineage, represented the centerpiece of this ambition. At mid-morning, a rider approached from the ridge trail, one of the sentries Eleanor had observed the previous day. He dismounted hurriedly and approached Holloway, clearly bearing important news. "Captain," he called, loud enough for Eleanor to hear clearly, "posse from Pinecrest reached Devil's Gulch last night. They found our decoy camp but figured out pretty quickly we weren't there." Holloway's posture tensed slightly. "Are they following our trail here?" "No, sir. They're still searching the area around the gulch, just like you predicted. Mason's plan worked. They're wasting time looking for the Blackfoot sign." Eleanor smiled grimly at this confirmation of her assessment. Thompson was following her instructions perfectly, maintaining the appearance of a thorough but misdirected search, giving her the time she needed to work alone. "And the woman? The widow?" Holloway asked, an edge entering his voice. The sentry shook his head. "No sign of any woman with them. Just the marshal and about 15 men, mostly ranchers by the look of them." This exchange confirmed another of Eleanor's suspicions. Her separation from the posse hadn't been detected. Holloway still didn't know she was tracking him independently. "Keep watching the trail," Holloway ordered. "They'll figure out the Serpent Ridge route eventually, but by then we'll be long gone." As the camp settled into midday routines, Eleanor withdrew from her observation post, circling wide to approach the valley from a different angle. She needed to assess the terrain from multiple perspectives before formulating a plan. The odds, 7. Armed men against 1, made direct confrontation suicidal. But Eleanor had never relied on direct approaches, not when patience and superior knowledge of terrain could shift advantages. By early afternoon, she had completed a comprehensive survey of the valley, identifying 3 potential avenues of approach that would allow her to reach the horses without immediate detection. More importantly, she had located Holloway's planned escape route, a little-used trail leading northeast toward the territorial border. Their preparations suggested they intended to depart at dawn the following day. Eleanor returned to her original observation point, settling in to watch the afternoon activities in the camp. The discipline she'd noted earlier continued to impress. Her professional assessment, Holloway ran his criminal operation with the same efficiency he'd likely employed as a cavalry officer. Guards rotated at regular intervals, horses received careful attention, and supplies were managed with military precision. As the afternoon wore on, an unexpected opportunity presented itself. Gabriel Reyes departed the camp with another man, heading toward the ridge where the sentries maintained their watch. Their absence reduced Holloway's force to 5 men, still dangerous odds, but significantly better than 7. More promising still, clouds began gathering over the western peaks, suggesting an approaching storm. Eleanor studied these developments with the experienced eye of someone who had learned to use weather as an ally rather than an obstacle. A mountain storm would provide excellent cover for her approach, reducing visibility, masking sounds, and forcing Holloway's men to focus on securing the camp rather than maintaining vigilant outward security. Perfect, she whispered to herself, a plan crystallizing in her mind. The storm arrived with dramatic swiftness, as mountain weather often did. Wind-driven rain lashed the valley floor, forcing Holloway's men to secure equipment and gather beneath canvas shelters. Eleanor used this distraction to advance her position, moving from her distant observation post to a cluster of boulders just 70 yards from the camp's edge. From this new vantage, she could observe details previously invisible, including the specific arrangement of Holloway's tent and its proximity to the horse corral. The Appaloosa stallion had been separated from the other horses, secured in a makeshift stall closer to Holloway's quarters, further evidence of his special interest in the animal. Through sheets of rain, Eleanor watched the camp's activity with the patience of a predator. Holloway himself emerged briefly to check the horses, his movements betraying irritation at the storm's interference with his timetable. Their planned departure would likely be delayed if the weather didn't improve. By morning, an unexpected advantage for Eleanor's developing strategy. As darkness fell, the storm intensified. Lightning illuminated the valley in staccato flashes, followed by thunder that echoed off the surrounding peaks. Between these natural illuminations, darkness so complete it seemed tangible enveloped the landscape. For most pursuers, such conditions would render further action impossible. For Eleanor Reynolds, they represented perfect operational conditions. She withdrew from her observation position just long enough to make final preparations. From her pack, she removed several specialized tools developed during her army tracking days, including a small kit containing charcoal and bear grease, which she used to darken her face and hands, eliminating the possibility of reflected light, betraying her movement. From a concealed pocket in her jacket, she withdrew a slender case containing 3 small glass vials, another legacy of her tracking career. Each contained a different compound designed by an army chemist who had recognized the tactical value of Eleanor's tracking abilities. One created light smoke when exposed to air, useful for detecting wind patterns. Another produced a sharp odor that could temporarily disorient guard dogs. The third, the one she selected now, was designed to calm agitated horses by mimicking familiar herd scents. Eleanor returned to the edge of the camp, using lightning flashes to time her movements. Between periods of complete darkness, each advance brought her closer to the corral where her horses were kept, each pause allowing her to confirm that Holloway's guards remained huddled under their makeshift shelters, more concerned with staying dry than maintaining vigilance. 50 yards from the camp's edge, Eleanor encountered the first real challenge, a clearing that offered no cover between her position and the corral. Crossing it would leave her exposed, if only momentarily, during the next lightning flash. She studied the guards' positions, calculating timing and fields of vision. The 2 nearest men had positioned themselves beneath a canvas tarp, their backs to the clearing as they focused on maintaining a small fire. The timing would need to be perfect, advancing during the darkness between lightning strikes, freezing in absolute stillness whenever illumination threatened. Eleanor waited, counting the seconds between lightning flashes to establish their pattern. When she was confident in her timing, she began her approach, a fluid, silent advance that covered ground with remarkable speed while making no more noise than the rain itself. Halfway across the clearing, lightning split the sky. Eleanor instantly froze in place, becoming as immobile as the surrounding boulders. The momentary illumination revealed her in the open, but the guards remained focused on their fire, never turning to witness the dark figure crossing their perimeter. Darkness returned, and Eleanor completed her crossing, reaching the shelter of the corral fence unseen. Here, inches from her stolen horses, she paused to assess the new situation. Thunder, her personal mount, was closest, his distinctive white blaze visible even in the dim light. The Morgan had been with her for 5 years and knew her scent intimately. Eleanor emitted a soft, barely audible whistle, a signal she had trained Thunder to recognize. The horse's ears immediately pricked forward, head turning toward the sound. She whistled again, softer still, and the Morgan moved cautiously in her direction, careful not to disturb the other horses. When Thunder reached the fence where she crouched, Eleanor extended her hand, allowing him to confirm her identity through scent. The horse's soft nicker of recognition was drowned by a perfectly timed thunderclap. "Good boy," she whispered, stroking his nose gently. "We're going home soon." With Thunder's position secured, Eleanor turned her attention to Cloudwalker. The Appaloosa stallion had been separated from the other horses, confined in a makeshift stall constructed near Holloway's tent, evidence of the special value he placed on the animal. Retrieving the stallion would be significantly more challenging than approaching Thunder, requiring her to penetrate the very heart of the camp. Most people would have deemed such an attempt impossible under the circumstances. Even experienced military scouts would have balked at the odds. But Eleanor Reynolds had built her reputation on accomplishing exactly this kind of impossible infiltration. She moved along the edge of the corral, using the horses themselves as visual cover. The rain continued to hammer down, reducing visibility and masking any small sounds her movement might make. When she reached the far side of the enclosure, closest to where Cloudwalker was kept, she uncorked the special vial and allowed a few drops of its contents to spill onto her palm. The scent was imperceptible to humans, but would be instantly recognizable to horses as a calming pheromone. Eleanor applied a small amount to her wrists and neck, then recorked the vial carefully. This preparation would help prevent the stallion from nickering or showing excitement when he detected her presence, a sound that could alert the entire camp. Between Cloudwalker's makeshift stall and Eleanor's position stood 30 feet of open ground, then Holloway's tent itself. The arrangement meant she would need to circle behind the tent to approach the stallion unseen, a path that would bring her within feet of Holloway himself. Eleanor studied the terrain with absolute focus, plotting each step of her approach in advance. The next phase would require perfect execution, a test of every skill she had developed in 15 years of tracking. Lightning illuminated the scene, freezing it in stark relief for a split second. In that moment, Eleanor noted critical details. The exact position of Holloway's tent, a narrow gap between canvas and ground where water was channeling away. The precise arrangement of guide ropes and stakes securing the structure. When darkness returned, she began her approach, moving not in a crouched walk, but in the fluid belly crawl that Grey Wolf had taught her for approaching wary game. Each movement was precisely controlled, distributing her weight to prevent creating pressure, points that might snap twigs or disturb stones. The muddy ground, which most would consider an obstacle, actually facilitated her silent advance, allowing her to slide forward with minimal friction. As she reached Holloway's tent, rain pounded against the canvas just inches above her head. Within, she could hear movement, the sound of a map being unfolded, then Holloway's voice speaking to someone else inside. "We leave at first light, regardless of the weather," he was saying. "I don't like being pinned in this valley with a posse, potentially on our trail." "What about Reynolds?" the other voice asked, Curtis Walsh by the sound of it. "If Parker talked, they might know who you are, your history." A long pause followed, during which Eleanor remained absolutely motionless, despite rain pooling around. Her prone form. "Reynolds is dead," Holloway finally responded, though something in his tone suggested less certainty than his words. "Died at Black Rock Pass 7 years ago." "You never found a body," Walsh pointed out. No one could have survived those wounds without immediate medical attention, Holloway countered, and the nearest outpost was a 3 days' ride. Eleanor allowed, herself a grim smile in the darkness. Holloway had underestimated her then, just as he was underestimating her now. That mistake had allowed her to survive Black Rock Pass, and it would be his undoing here as well. She continued her careful advance, circling to the back of the tent where Cloudwalker's makeshift stall had been constructed. The Appaloosa stood alert despite the weather, his distinctive spotted coat visible even in the darkness. As she approached, the stallion's ears flicked forward, sensing movement that didn't match the storm's patterns. Eleanor waited for thunder, before releasing another soft, specialized whistle, different from the one she'd used with thunder, specific to Cloudwalker's training. The stallion's head turned sharply in her direction, nostrils flaring as he caught her scent. For a heart-stopping moment, Eleanor feared the horse might whinny in recognition, a sound that would instantly alert Holloway to her presence. But the calming compound did its work, allowing the stallion to recognize her without becoming excited. Instead, he extended his muzzle toward her, seeking confirmation of her identity. Eleanor reached up slowly, allowing her palm to rest against the stallion's nose. The contact confirmed what she'd observed earlier. Cloudwalker was unharmed and in good condition, despite the forced journey through difficult terrain. Having confirmed her horse's welfare, Eleanor withdrew as carefully as she had approached, retracing her path with the same methodical silence. The return journey across the camp's perimeter proved easier than the entry, as the storm had intensified further, driving even the most diligent guards deeper into their shelters. When she reached the safety of the forest's edge, Eleanor paused, only long enough to wipe the darkening compound from her face before continuing to her original observation post. The reconnaissance had been a complete success. She now possessed detailed knowledge of the camp's layout, guard positions, Holloway's planned departure time, and most importantly, confirmation that her horses were healthy and accessible. More significant still was the psychological advantage she'd gained. She had penetrated to the very heart of Holloway's operation without detection, coming close enough to overhear his private conversations. She had confirmed his vulnerability, his uncertainty about her fate at Black Rock Pass, his concern about the approaching posse, and his accelerated departure plans. As Eleanor settled into a sheltered position to wait out the remaining hours until dawn, she reflected on the night's achievements. What she had just accomplished would have seemed impossible to most: infiltrating an armed camp during a thunderstorm, approaching prized horses without alerting their guards, gathering critical intelligence while remaining completely undetected. Yet, to Eleanor Reynolds, it had been simply the application of skills honed over decades, the culmination of training that began with Grey Wolf's patient instruction and continued through years of practical experience in the most challenging terrains. The frontier offered. The storm gradually diminished as night deepened, stars occasionally appearing through breaks in the clouds. Tomorrow would bring the final confrontation with Holloway, the resolution of unfinished business, 7 years in the making. But tonight had provided something equally valuable: absolute confirmation that the tracker known as Shadow Walker had lost none of her exceptional abilities during her years in hiding. Eleanor Reynolds had not just returned, she had returned at the peak of her formidable powers. Dawn broke clear after the night storm, sunlight glistening on rain-drenched foliage throughout the valley. Inside his tent, Victor Holloway bent over maps, spread across a portable campaign desk, a relic of his military days that he carried on every operation. His finger traced the route they would take toward the territorial border, mentally calculating travel times with the stolen horses. "We leave in 1 hour," he informed Curtis Walsh, who stood at attention nearby, another holdover from their military service. "Send Reyes to recall the sentries from the ridge. No point maintaining those positions if we're moving out." Walsh nodded sharply. What about the widow's horses? Still planning to keep the Appaloosa separate? Yes, that stallion travels with me. Something about him. Holloway paused, a faint frown creasing his scarred face. The breeding, the conformation, it reminds me of stock I've seen before. Army remount program? Walsh suggested. You said it had Nez Perce bloodlines. Perhaps. Holloway rolled the maps with practiced efficiency. But there's something else. The training, the responsiveness. It's like... He broke off as Gabriel Reyes burst into the tent without the customary announcement. His normally composed features tense with alarm. Captain, the scout said urgently, we have a problem. Holloway straightened, instantly alert. Report. I was checking the perimeter before sending men to recover the sentries, Reyes explained, his words precise despite his evident concern. Found tracks that weren't there yesterday evening. Holloway's expression hardened. The posse? They've found us already? No. Reyes shook his head decisively. Single tracker, light footprint, expertly placed. Whoever it was circled our entire camp last night during the storm. Impossible, Walsh interjected. No one could navigate these mountains in that weather, let alone approach our camp undetected. But Holloway had gone very still, his face draining of color as he processed the implications. Show me, he ordered quietly. Reyes led them to the camp's northern perimeter where the ground, softened by rain, had preserved a partial boot print nearly invisible against the surrounding terrain. To an ordinary observer, it would appear as merely another depression caused by the storm. To experienced trackers like Holloway and Reyes, it represented something far more concerning. Deliberate human passage, expertly concealed. There, Reyes indicated, crouching to better display the sign. And here, where they paused to observe, the spacing indicates someone moving with extreme caution, deliberately minimizing their trail. Holloway studied the faint impressions, his expression growing, increasingly grim. How close did they come to the camp? Reyes hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with his findings. That's what disturbed me, Captain. They didn't just circle the perimeter. They penetrated our interior defenses. He led them toward the corral where the stolen horses were kept. Look here, near where the Morgan is picketed. Someone approached close enough to touch the animal. Walsh cursed softly. How the hell did they get past our guards? Because they're not just any tracker, Holloway replied, his voice oddly distant as he knelt to examine the sign more closely. His fingers traced a barely perceptible impression in the mud, the outline of a knee where someone had knelt beside the corral. There's only one person I've ever known who could move like this. Who? Walsh demanded, but the growing recognition in Holloway's eyes suggested he already knew the answer. Reynolds, Holloway whispered, the name emerging like a ghost from his past. Eleanor Reynolds. Reyes looked between the two men in confusion. The tracker from Black Rock Pass. You said she died there. I thought she did. Holloway stood slowly, unconsciously touching the scar that ran along his face, a permanent reminder of his last encounter with the Army's legendary tracker. No one could have survived those wounds. That terrain. He fell silent, mind racing. Through implications. If Eleanor Reynolds had survived Black Rock Pass, if she had somehow tracked him here, the widow, he realized suddenly, connections forming rapidly. The widow who owned the Appaloosa. She's Reynolds. Walsh's expression shifted from confusion to alarm. If that's true, we're in serious trouble, Captain. Reynolds knew all our counter-tracking techniques, our escape routes. She knows everything, Holloway cut him off, his tactical mind already processing this new threat. And she was here, in our camp last night, close enough to touch the horses. Why didn't she take them? Reyes asked reasonably. If she got that close undetected, why not simply steal them back? Because this isn't just about the horses anymore, Holloway replied grimly. This is about Black Rock Pass, unfinished business. He strode rapidly toward Cloudwalker's makeshift stall, mind connecting pieces he should have recognized earlier. The stallion's exceptional quality, the precise training, the unusual responsiveness, all hallmarks of Reynolds' horsemanship. 7 years ago he'd stolen cavalry mounts she'd helped train. Now, unwittingly, he'd stolen her personal stock. Approaching the Appaloosa, Holloway noticed something he'd overlooked before, a small, distinctive brand partially hidden beneath. The animal's spotted coat. Not the typical ranch mark, but the symbol of the Army Scout Corps, modified with a personal identifier he recognized instantly. "It is her," he murmured, a complex mixture of emotions crossing his features, shock, anger, and something that might have been respected. "She's alive, and she's here." Walsh had followed, anxiety evident in his posture. "What do we do, Captain? If Reynolds is tracking us, the usual escape routes won't work." Holloway's mind raced through options with military precision. If Reynolds was alive, if she had tracked him here and penetrated his camp undetected, then everything had changed. She would anticipate his planned route and would already have mapped potential ambush points. Worse, if she had connected with the Pinecrest posse, she could guide them directly to intercept his escape. "Change of plans," he announced, a decision formed. "We split up. Curtis, you take 4 men and most of the horses. Follow the original route toward Montana Territory. Make it obvious. Leave clear sign." "A decoy," Walsh understood immediately. "And you?" "I'll take Reyes and the Appaloosa. We'll use the high pass, the one we marked as too dangerous for moving stock. That route's barely passable this time of year," Reyes objected. "The recent storm will have made conditions even worse." "Exactly," Holloway nodded. "Reynolds would never expect us to attempt it, especially with a valuable horse. She'll follow the main group, the obvious trail." Walsh looked skeptical. "And if she doesn't? If she somehow tracks you instead?" Holloway's hand dropped to his revolver, an unconscious gesture that answered the question more clearly than words. "Then I finish what I started at Black Rock Pass." He turned away, issuing rapid orders to break camp. As men rushed to comply, Holloway returned to his tent, mind troubled by developments he hadn't anticipated. From a locked chest, he withdrew a weathered journal, his personal record of operations dating back to his army days. Flipping to entries from 7 years earlier, he reread his own account of the Black Rock Pass incident. The written words were clinical, detailing the ambush of pursuing army trackers with dispassionate precision. 5 confirmed casualties, including Lieutenant David Reynolds. 1 wounded tracker, Eleanor Reynolds, left for dead with a shoulder wound that should have been fatal given the remote location. What the journal didn't capture was the respect Holloway had held for Reynolds' tracking abilities, respect that had motivated him to ensure she was wounded rather than killed outright when he'd had the chance for a cleaner shot. Even as he'd fled with stolen horses, leaving her bleeding on the mountainside, he'd recognized her exceptional skill. In the years since, he'd incorporated many of her tracking techniques into his own operations, adapting her methods to avoid pursuit. And now she had found him anyway, penetrating to the heart of his camp during conditions that should have made tracking impossible. Holloway closed the journal, decision crystallizing. If Reynolds was truly the widow from Pinecrest, if she had spent 7 years in hiding only to resurface when he unwittingly stole her horses, then she represented a threat unlike any he'd faced since leaving the military. No ordinary posse could track him through the high pass in current conditions, but Reynolds was no ordinary tracker. "Captain?" Reyes appeared at the tent entrance. "Men are ready to move out." Holloway nodded sharply, sliding the journal into his saddlebag. "Tell Walsh to make their trail obvious. Broken branches, disturbed water crossings, everything that would attract a tracker's attention." "And our trail?" the scout inquired. "The opposite. Use every counter-tracking measure we know. I want nothing left for even Reynolds to follow." As Reyes departed to relay these instructions, Holloway stood alone in his tent, mind calculating probabilities with military precision. The logical course would be to abandon the Appaloosa, the animal that had apparently triggered Reynolds. Return to tracking. With the stallion left behind, she might be satisfied and abandon pursuit, but Holloway recognized his own nature too well to consider that option seriously. He hadn't built his post-military operation through logical retreat or abandoning valuable assets. More importantly, the prospect of matching skills with Reynolds again, the tracker whose abilities had become almost mythical in certain military circles, appealed to something fundamental in his character. 7 years, he murmured to himself, unconsciously touching the scar that stretched across his face. During his last confrontation with Reynolds, overconfidence had cost him. A moment's inattention that allowed her to score a deep cut with her hunting knife before he fired the shot that should have ended her pursuit permanently. This time, he would make no such mistake. This time, he would finally determine which of them was truly the superior tracker. Outside, men worked efficiently to break camp, dividing supplies and preparing horses for 2 separate journeys. Walsh supervised the larger group with typical military precision, while Reyes prepared 3 horses for the high pass route. Holloway's mount, his own, and the Appaloosa stallion that had unwittingly reconnected 2 opponents from 7 years. Past! Holloway emerged from his tent, scanning the surrounding forest with new awareness. Somewhere out there, Eleanor Reynolds was watching, planning, calculating, preparing to pursue. He felt her presence with a certainty that transcended rational explanation, a hunter's instinct recognizing another predator in shared territory. "She'll follow the main group," Walsh said as Holloway approached, though his tone suggested less confidence than his words. "The obvious trail. The majority of the stolen horses. It's the logical choice." "Reynolds was never predictable," Holloway replied, checking his saddle girth with practiced movements. "That's what made her so effective as a tracker. She thinks beyond the obvious." "Then why split our forces at all?" Walsh challenged. "If you believe she'll see through the deception?" Holloway mounted with fluid grace, looking down at his longtime second-in-command. "Because uncertainty forces caution, Curtis. If she can't be certain which group has the Appaloosa, she'll have to make a choice. And any time spent determining which trail to follow is time gained for both groups." Walsh nodded reluctantly, recognizing the tactical soundness of the approach, despite his concerns. "Take care in those high passes, Captain. I don't like the idea of you facing Reynolds with only Reyes for backup." "I faced her at Black Rock Pass and prevailed," Holloway reminded him, though memory of that victory felt suddenly less certain than it had for 7 years. "We'll rendezvous at Sullivan's as planned, with or without pursuit." The 2 groups departed simultaneously, Walsh leading 5 men and 9 horses eastward along obvious trails, while Holloway, Reyes, and the Appaloosa struck out northward toward the forbidding peaks that marked the high pass route. As they separated, Holloway found himself scanning the surrounding forest once more, unable to shake the sensation of being observed. "She's watching us right now," he said quietly to Reyes as they entered denser tree cover. "Probably since before." "Dawn!" Reyes, whose Apache heritage had instilled a healthy respect for exceptional trackers, nodded soberly. "What makes you so certain?" "Because it's what I would do," Holloway replied. "And Reynolds was always better." This acknowledgement, something he would never have voiced to Walsh or the other men, revealed the respect that underlay his apparent confidence. In their previous encounter, he had prevailed through superior numbers and careful preparation, not superior skill. Now, with forces divided and Reynolds forewarned, the coming confrontation would test very different capabilities. As they climbed toward higher elevations, navigating treacherous terrain made more dangerous by the recent storm, Holloway found himself reviewing every counter-tracking technique he knew. Reyes, riding slightly ahead, implemented these measures automatically, brushing away tracks where possible, using rocky ground that held no impressions, occasionally backtracking to create false trails before resuming their true course. Despite these precautions, Holloway harbored no illusions about their effectiveness against Reynolds. She wouldn't track them by obvious signs like boot prints or disturbed vegetation. Her methods had always been more subtle, reading pressure patterns in moss that most wouldn't even notice, detecting changes in spider webs across a trail, noting the behavior of birds and small animals disturbed by human passage. The knowledge that they were being pursued by someone with near supernatural tracking abilities created a tension that even Holloway's military discipline couldn't entirely suppress. Each ridge they crested, each valley they traversed, he found himself glancing back, not expecting to see a pursuer, but unable to escape the certainty that one followed nonetheless. By midday, they had reached elevations where patches of snow still lingered in shadowed areas despite the summer season. The trail narrowed dramatically, in places barely wide enough for a single horse to pass safely, with sheer drops of hundreds of feet to one side. The Appaloosa stallion, despite his evident quality, struggled with certain passages, requiring Holloway to dismount and lead him personally across the most treacherous sections. "This route is barely passable now," Reyes observed, as they paused to rest the horses on a small plateau. "Another day of climbing, and we reach sections that might be impassable with the stallion." "We'll manage," Holloway replied, his tone allowing no debate. "Reynolds would expect us to avoid this route precisely because of its difficulty with horses. That expectation is our advantage." Reyes studied his commander thoughtfully. "You respect her abilities greatly," he observed. "More than any opponent we've faced." Holloway's gaze drifted to the distant horizon, where storm clouds were gathering once more over the highest peaks. "I respect what she represents, Gabriel. Perfect tracking, the ability to read sign that others can't even see. In the army, they called her Shadow Walker. Some believed she could track a ghost across bare rock if ordered to." "No tracker is infallible," Reyes countered, professional pride evident in his tone. "Everyone leaves a sign, but everyone also misses a sign." "Reynolds missed less than most," Holloway acknowledged, "and now she's had 7 years to improve her methods, just as we've improved ours." As they resumed their journey, climbing ever higher toward passes rarely traversed even in ideal conditions, Holloway found himself in the unfamiliar position of being the pursued rather than the pursuer. Throughout his military career and subsequent criminal operations, he had always maintained tactical advantage, choosing terrain, setting terms of engagement, controlling variables. With Reynolds on his trail, that certainty had evaporated. For the first time in 7 years, Victor Holloway felt the unfamiliar sensation of genuine concern about the outcome of an operation. Not fear, precisely, but a veteran's recognition that he faced an opponent of exceptional capability. The Appaloosa stallion, cause of this unexpected reunion with his most formidable adversary, tossed his head as they navigated a particularly narrow section of trail. The animal's intelligence and sure-footedness impressed even Holloway's experienced assessment. In different circumstances, he might have appreciated the irony that his appreciation for exceptional horseflesh had led him unwittingly to steal from the one person in the territory most capable of tracking him down. "We'll make camp early," he decided as they reached a sheltered basin near the tree line. "The horses need rest before attempting the high pass tomorrow, and the weather's turning." Reyes nodded agreement, already assessing the location with a scout's eye for defensibility. Good visibility in all directions. Anyone approaching would be exposed for at least half a mile. "Set snares on the approach trails," Holloway instructed, as they dismounted. "Nothing lethal. I want warning of pursuit, not casualties that might attract territorial law." As Reyes moved to comply, Holloway found himself studying Cloudwalker with renewed interest. The stallion's exceptional quality made more sense now, knowing he had been bred and trained by Eleanor Reynolds. Army scouts developed special relationships with their mounts, training them to respond to commands inaudible to others, to stand perfectly still during surveillance, to move without typical horse noises when needed. "She'll come for you specifically," he told the animal quietly, stroking its powerful neck. "Not just because of your value, but because you're hers." The stallion regarded him with intelligent eyes that seemed almost to comprehend the situation. In that gaze, Holloway recognized something he hadn't anticipated. The horse was tolerating his handling, but its loyalty remained elsewhere. Despite his own considerable skill with horses, this animal would never respond to him the way it would to its true owner. That realization crystallized Holloway's assessment of his situation. He wasn't just being pursued by an exceptional tracker. He was being hunted by someone with multiple advantages: intimate knowledge of his methods, superior tracking ability, and a connection to the very horse he was attempting to escape with. For the first time since Black Rock Pass, Victor Holloway found himself considering the possibility of defeat. Slate-gray clouds hung low over the mountain peaks, promising another storm before nightfall. Eleanor crouched on a rocky outcropping, field glasses trained on the small camp established in the basin below. Through the powerful lenses, she could clearly see Holloway and Reyes making preparations for the coming weather, securing equipment, establishing a sheltered fire pit, setting up a crude lean-to where the Appaloosa stallions stood tethered. She had anticipated Holloway's strategy perfectly. While the main group of thieves created an obvious trail eastward, Holloway himself had taken the far more treacherous high pass route, gambling that the difficult terrain would deter pursuit. It might have worked against ordinary trackers. Against Eleanor Reynolds, it had merely confirmed which group to follow. The signs had been subtle but unmistakable. Cloudwalker's distinctive hoof pattern briefly visible in a patch of mud before entering rocky terrain, a single white hair caught. On a thorny bush at a switchback, the way certain birds took flight from specific trees as the small party passed. To most eyes, these would appear as random wilderness occurrences. To Eleanor, they formed a clear narrative of passage. "Oldest trick in the book, Victor," she murmured, lowering the glasses. "Split your forces when facing a superior tracker. You taught me that technique yourself during joint operations." Eleanor had maintained a careful distance throughout the day, never closing to visual range, tracking through sign rather than sight. This caution had served her well when she discovered the warning snares Reyes had set on approach trails, simple arrangements of stones and twigs that would alert the camp to anyone following the obvious path. Now, as afternoon waned toward evening, she had positioned herself advantageously, above their camp with clear sightlines, multiple approach options, and a perfect understanding of the terrain they all occupied. Tactical advantage had shifted decisively in her favor. Eleanor studied the situation with professional detachment, assessing variables and forming a strategy. Holloway and Reyes were experienced, armed, and dangerous. A frontal confrontation would be unnecessarily risky, but the approaching storm offered opportunities that a lifetime of tracking had taught her to exploit. She retreated from her observation point, circling wide to approach the basin from its western edge, where a series of massive boulders provided both cover and a route down the otherwise sheer cliff face. This approach would position her downwind of the camp, vital for avoiding detection by either the men or the horses. As she carefully picked her way down the boulder field, Eleanor reviewed the equipment she carried: the Colt revolver in its shoulder holster, a rope coiled at her belt, various small tools secured in her vest pockets. She traveled light by necessity, but each item had been selected with specific contingencies in mind. The first raindrops began to fall as she reached the basin floor, pattering against leaves and stone with increasing intensity. Wind gusts swirled through the high mountain valley, carrying her scent away from the camp while generating ambient noise that would mask small sounds of movement. Perfect conditions for her approach. Eleanor moved through the underbrush with practiced silence, each step placed with deliberate care despite the gathering storm. Holloway and Reyes had retreated to their makeshift shelter, focused on maintaining a small fire against the encroaching cold and wet. The horses stood beneath a crude lean-to, constructed of canvas and pine branches, their backs to the wind. She circled to position herself near the horses, noting that Cloudwalker had been picketed separately from the other mounts, evidence of his special status in Holloway's plans. The stallion's head came up slightly as Eleanor drew nearer, nostrils flaring as he caught her scent despite the rain. Eleanor froze, concerned that the horse might betray her presence with a welcoming nicker. But years of specialized training held. Cloudwalker registered her presence, but made no sound, merely shifting slightly in her direction. The stallion's intelligence had always impressed her. Now it served them both well. The storm intensified, dramatically turning from steady rain to driving downpour in minutes. Lightning flashed across the darkening sky, followed by booming thunder that echoed through the mountain basin. Eleanor used the natural cover to close the final distance to the horses, materializing beside Cloudwalker like a spirit emerging. From the storm itself, "Easy, boy," she whispered, stroking his neck reassuringly while checking him for injuries. The stallion pressed against her hand, clearly recognizing his owner despite the days of separation. Eleanor quickly assessed her options. In ideal circumstances, she would simply take the horse and disappear back into the storm, avoiding confrontation entirely. But Holloway's camp was positioned such that any attempt to lead the stallion away would necessarily pass within view of the shelter where the men huddled. The other horses would likely react to Cloudwalker's departure as well, creating noise that would alert their captors. No, this confrontation could not be avoided. 7 years of unfinished business would be resolved here, one way or another. Eleanor secured her pack and prepared to move toward the shelter where Holloway and Reyes remained unaware of her presence. Before she could advance, however, the decision was made for her. "I wouldn't," Holloway's voice cut through the storm's background noise, calm and measured. Eleanor turned slowly to find him standing 20 feet away, revolver drawn but held at his side rather than aimed directly at her. Despite the years since their last encounter, she recognized him instantly. The distinctive scar running from temple to jaw, the military bearing that civilian clothes couldn't disguise, the calculating intelligence in his eyes as he assessed the situation. "Victor," she acknowledged, keeping her hands visible but making no threatening movements. "It's been a while." Reynolds. A complex mixture of emotions crossed his features. Surprise, respect, and something that might have been regret. "You're supposed to be dead." "Sorry to disappoint." Eleanor remained outwardly calm, despite the surge of memories his presence evoked. David's death, her own near-fatal wounding, 7 years of hiding from who she truly was. Holloway gestured with his free hand toward Cloudwalker. "Exceptional animal. I should have recognized your work in his training." His eyes narrowed slightly. "The widow Blackwood, I presume." "You've been stealing from the wrong people, Victor," Eleanor replied, deliberately using his first name, a reminder of their history, when they had worked on opposite sides of the same military structure. "First Army remounts, now my personal stock." "Professional appreciation," he countered, seemingly content to maintain conversation despite the worsening storm. "Quality horseflesh is increasingly rare on the frontier. Your Appaloosa represents bloodlines worth preserving. Then you should have offered to buy him." Eleanor shifted slightly, using the movement to assess the tactical situation more completely. Reyes was nowhere visible, a concerning absence that suggested he was circling. To flank her position, Holloway noted her scan. Gabriel's securing our perimeter. Old habits die hard. A humorless smile crossed his features. Though clearly your tracking skills haven't diminished. Following us through this terrain in these conditions, impressive work, Reynolds. Just like old times. Not quite like old times, Eleanor corrected him. This time I'm not following army orders. This is personal. Blackrock Pass, Holloway nodded, understanding immediately. You've carried that for 7 years. You killed my husband. The words emerged with quiet intensity, 7 years of suppressed emotion, lending them weight beyond their simplicity. Holloway's expression sobered. It was a military operation gone wrong. Regrettable casualties. Regrettable? Eleanor's voice remained controlled, but her eyes flashed dangerously. You ambushed a legitimate pursuit, killed 5 men, and left me for dead on that mountainside. And yet, here you stand, Holloway observed, genuine curiosity entering his tone. How did you survive? That shoulder wound should have been fatal. Without immediate treatment, I tracked through worse terrain with worse injuries before that day, Eleanor replied simply. Another 12 miles to the nearest outpost wasn't going to stop me. Lightning illuminated the scene in stark relief, briefly turning the rain to shimmering silver curtains around them. In that frozen moment, Eleanor detected movement at the edge of her vision. Reyes attempting to circle behind her, using the storm's cover just as she had. Call off your scout, Victor, she advised calmly. This doesn't have to become complicated. It's already complicated, Holloway countered, making no move to signal Reyes. You've tracked me for 7 years, waited for the perfect moment to settle accounts. That suggests you're not here just to recover stolen horses. Eleanor studied him thoughtfully, realizing that despite their history, Holloway didn't fully understand her motivation. He assumed she sought revenge for Blackrock Pass, a natural conclusion given the circumstances. The truth was more complex. I didn't track you for 7 years, she corrected him. I walked away from tracking entirely after Blackrock Pass. Built a new life, a different identity. Eleanor Reynolds ceased to exist. Confusion flickered across Holloway's features. Then why now? Why come out of hiding over a few stolen horses? Because you forced my hand, Eleanor explained, her voice carrying over the storm's background noise. You stole more than horses, Victor. You stole the life I'd built, the future I was creating. Understanding dawned in Holloway's eyes. You weren't hunting me at all. You were hiding from yourself. The insight struck with uncomfortable accuracy. Before Eleanor could respond, Reyes made his move, emerging from the underbrush with rifle raised. Eleanor pivoted smoothly, her Colt appearing in her hand with the fluid speed that had earned her the nickname Quicksilver among certain army circles. Don't, she advised the scout, her aim unwavering despite the rain streaming down her face. I have no quarrel with you, Reyes. The scout froze, clearly recognizing the deadly competence in her stance. His eyes flickered toward Holloway, seeking direction. Lower your weapon, Gabriel, Holloway ordered after a tense moment. Mrs. Blackwood, or Reynolds isn't here to kill us, are you? The question carried genuine curiosity rather than sarcasm. Eleanor kept her revolver trained on Reyes until he complied, then shifted her aim to cover both men. I came for my horses, nothing more. Yet you tracked me personally rather than following. The main group with the majority of the stolen stock, Holloway pointed out. You knew I'd take the Appaloosa. I knew you'd recognize quality when you saw it, Eleanor confirmed. Just as I knew you'd take the most challenging escape route, the one most trackers couldn't follow. A reluctant smile touched Holloway's scarred features. You always did. Understand how I think, Reynolds, better than most of my own officers. Professional courtesy, she replied, echoing his earlier words. Now, I'm taking Cloudwalker and leaving. You two can explain to your associates why you're returning empty-handed. Holloway studied her for a long moment, rain streaming down his face, calculation evident in his expression. And what prevents me from simply shooting you once you turn? You're back, finishing what I started at Blackrock Pass? Two things, Eleanor answered without hesitation. First, Marshal Thompson and a 15-man posse know exactly where I am and who I'm pursuing. They're less than half a day behind me. And second, Holloway prompted, skepticism evident. You're not a murderer, Victor, she said, with quiet certainty. A thief, yes, dishonorably discharged, certainly, but you had a clear shot at Blackrock Pass and chose to wound rather than kill. That wasn't an accident or poor aim. The observation seemed to unsettle him more than any threat could have. You give me too much credit, Reynolds. I give you exactly the credit you've earned, Eleanor countered. We were on opposite sides of a mission gone wrong. Professional opponents, not personal enemies. Their conversation was interrupted by a deafening crack as lightning struck a nearby pine, sending splinters flying and startling the horses. In the momentary chaos, Reyes made another move, raising his rifle despite Holloway's earlier order. Eleanor's reaction was instant. Her revolver cracked sharply, the bullet striking Reyes's rifle with surgical precision, sending it spinning from his grasp without touching the man himself. The display of marksmanship froze both men momentarily. Even through the driving rain, the shot had threaded between Reyes's hands, striking metal rather than flesh, with deliberate accuracy. That was your only warning, Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the escalation. The next one won't be so. Carefully placed, Holloway raised a hand to forestall any further action from his scout. Stand down, Gabriel. To Eleanor he added with genuine admiration, your reputation for non-lethal resolution remains intact. Impressive shooting. I never wanted to kill Victor, she replied simply. Not even after Blackrock Pass. I just wanted to understand why. The admission seemed to catch Holloway off guard. For a moment, the hardened criminal facade slipped, revealing the military officer he had once been. Orders, he said finally. Not legitimate ones, but orders nonetheless. A general's son with diplomatic immunity was running a horse theft operation. When I reported it through proper channels, I was instructed to ignore what I'd seen. His expression hardened. So I made a different choice. And when were we sent to track you? Eleanor pressed. I couldn't allow myself to be captured. Holloway explained, something like regret entering his tone. Not with the evidence I'd accumulated. The ambush wasn't planned specifically for you and Reynolds. It was meant for whoever they sent. The revelation hung between them, offering context but not justification for the deaths at Blackrock Pass. Eleanor absorbed this new information, weighing it against 7 years of assumptions and unanswered questions. It doesn't change what happened, she said finally, but it helps me understand. Thank you for that, at least. The storm was beginning to diminish, the driving rain softening to a steady downpour. In the distance, thunder rumbled like retreating artillery, moving eastward across the mountains. What now, Reynolds? Holloway asked, making no move toward his holstered revolver, despite the apparent stalemate. You take the Appaloosa and we all pretend this encounter never happened? Return to our respective lives? Eleanor shook her head, slowly. I'm taking Cloudwalker, yes, but we both know there's no returning to how things were. The widow Blackwood's cover is blown. Parker will have told everyone in 3 territories about Eleanor Reynolds by now, and your operation has lost its anonymity as well. A mutual destruction of carefully constructed facades, Holloway observed with ironic appreciation. Fitting, I suppose. Eleanor moved toward Cloudwalker, maintaining her aim on the 2 men. The stallion stood calmly, despite the storm and tension, a testament to his training and intelligence. Marshal Thompson offered me a territorial deputy's badge, she informed Holloway as she united the Appaloosa's lead rope. Said my tracking skills were wasted on breeding horses. Holloway's eyebrows rose slightly. And did you accept? Not yet. Eleanor mounted the stallion with fluid grace, her revolver never wavering from its coverage of both men. But recent events have reminded me that some skills shouldn't be hidden away, regardless of past failures. You never failed, Reynolds, Holloway said with surprising sincerity. Blackrock Pass wasn't your mistake. It was mine for underestimating what you'd become capable of in the years since we'd last crossed paths. The compliment, unexpected from a long-time adversary, momentarily caught Eleanor off guard. Is that an admission or a warning, Victor? Perhaps both, he acknowledged with a faint smile. The woman who tracked me through these mountains, in these conditions, isn't someone I'd care to have as a permanent enemy. Eleanor gathered Cloudwalker's reins, preparing to depart. That's entirely up to you. Stay clear of my horses and Elk Valley, and we have no quarrel. And if we encounter each other professionally, Holloway inquired, his tone suggesting he'd already anticipated her career change. You with a marshal's badge, me with my operations? Then, we'll both do what we must, Eleanor replied simply, but we'll do it with the understanding that comes from sharing opposite sides of the same history. She turned Cloudwalker toward the basin's eastern exit, the most direct route back toward Serpent Ridge and eventually Pinecrest. The stallion moved with confident sure-footedness despite the slick terrain, responding to her subtle guidance as though they'd never been separated. Reynolds, Holloway called after her, prompting her to pause and look back. For what it's worth, I'm sorry about your husband. He wasn't the target, you were. The tracker who could find me anywhere. Eleanor studied him for a long moment, rain streaming down her face, mixing with tears she hadn't realized she was shedding. I know, she said finally. That's why I can let you walk away today. With that, she urged Cloudwalker forward, leaving Holloway and Reyes standing in the diminishing storm. Neither man made any move to pursue or fire upon her retreating figure. Whether from tactical calculation or genuine respect, they allowed her departure uncontested. As she crested the ridge that would take her back toward Pinecrest, Eleanor paused to look back one final time. In the valley below, Holloway and Reyes were already breaking camp, presumably to attempt a different escape route now that their primary objective, the Appaloosa, was lost to them. The confrontation had not played out as she had imagined during 7 years of occasional nightmares and what-if scenarios. There had been no climactic gun battle, no dramatic vengeance for David's death. Instead, there had been truth, complicated, messy, human truth that offered context without absolution. Eleanor turned Cloudwalker eastward, guiding him carefully along the treacherous mountain path. The storm had passed, leaving behind that peculiar clarity of light that often follows mountain tempests. Below and ahead, the vast wilderness stretched toward Pinecrest and the life she had built there. But it wouldn't be the same life, couldn't be, after what had transpired. Eleanor Reynolds had emerged fully from behind Eleanor Blackwood's carefully constructed facade. The legendary tracker had returned, not to replace the widow, but to complete her. As if sensing her thoughts, Cloudwalker tossed his head and snorted, eager to return home. Eleanor patted his neck affectionately, acknowledging his impatience. "We're going home, boy," she assured him. "But to a different home than the one we left." The stallion's ears flicked back at the sound of her voice, then forward again as he navigated the rocky trail with intelligent care. Like his owner, he adapted to changing circumstances with resilient grace. 3 days later, as afternoon sunlight bathed Elk Valley in golden light, Eleanor crested the final ridge that overlooked Pinecrest. Cloudwalker, despite the arduous journey, carried himself proudly as they approached the town's outskirts. Word of their coming had evidently preceded them. Citizens lined the main street, watching with undisguised curiosity as the woman they Had known only as the quiet widow, Blackwood returned, astride her recovered stallion. At the town square, Marshal Thompson waited alongside Rebecca, both wearing expressions of relief and admiration. As Eleanor dismounted, Rebecca stepped forward. "To embrace her friend. You found him," the doctor said, running an appreciative hand along Cloudwalker's neck, "and returned in one piece yourself." "Holloway?" Thompson inquired, professional interest evident in his tone. "Alive," Eleanor replied simply, "with new understanding between us." The Marshal studied her thoughtfully, noting subtle changes in her bearing and expression, a confidence and centeredness that hadn't been present before. "My offer stands," he said, producing the Deputy Marshal's badge from his pocket. "The territory needs trackers with your skills, especially now that word has spread about Eleanor Reynolds returning to active duty." Eleanor accepted the badge, its weight familiar yet new in her palm. "Not just Eleanor Reynolds," she corrected gently. "Eleanor Blackwood remains as well. They're not separate people, just different facets of who I've always been." Thompson nodded, understanding. "And the ranch, your horses?" "They stay," Eleanor confirmed without hesitation. "A tracker needs a home to return to, a place to remember why the work matters." Rebecca smiled in approval. "Integration rather than division. Exactly what I hoped you'd discover out there." Eleanor glanced back toward the mountains where she had confronted not just Holloway, but her own divided sense of identity. The journey had been as much internal as external, leading to a reconciliation of past and present that she hadn't thought possible. "What happens now?" Rebecca asked as they led Cloudwalker toward the livery stable. "From what I hear, Marshal, Thompson has already received 3 telegrams from other territories requesting the Shadow Walkers' assistance with difficult tracking cases." Eleanor smiled, the expression reaching her eyes in a way it rarely had during her 7 years of self-imposed exile. "Now? I track. I breed horses. I build a life that incorporates all of who I am, without hiding or denying any part of that identity." As they reached the livery, Franklin Jennings approached, his expression markedly different from the dismissive skepticism he had shown before. "Mrs. Blackwood, or should I say, Marshal Reynolds?" he inquired, genuine respect evident in his tone. "I owe you an apology for my earlier doubts. What you accomplished, tracking those thieves through impossible conditions, recovering the horses single-handed, it's nothing short of remarkable." "No apology needed, Mr. Jennings," Eleanor replied graciously. "We all have our specialties. Mine just happens to be reading stories that others can't see." Later, as sunset painted Elk Valley in shades of amber and gold, Eleanor stood on the porch of her small ranch house, watching Cloudwalker graze contentedly in the pasture alongside Thunder and the other recovered horses. The deputy marshal's badge rested on the railing beside her, catching the fading light. The choice she had made on that mountainside, to reconcile Eleanor Reynolds with Eleanor Blackwood rather than choosing between them, felt increasingly right as days passed. The tracker's skills and the widow's wisdom were not opposing forces, but complementary strengths, each enhancing rather than diminishing the other. In the distance, storm clouds gathered over the western mountains, the same peaks where she had tracked Holloway, faced her past, and reclaimed her complete identity. Those mountains had witnessed her transformation from a woman hiding from herself into one who had found a way to integrate all aspects of her remarkable abilities. Eleanor picked up the badge, running her thumb over its surface thoughtfully. Tomorrow would bring new tracks to follow, new stories written in bent grass and disturbed stone. But tonight, she would remain here, perfectly balanced between the person she had been and the one she was becoming. The legendary tracker who could read stories in wilderness others couldn't even see had finally learned to read the most important story of all, her own. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.